children to school, we're actually the second educators in your children's life because you are the first teachers. And we want to work in partnership with all of you because we can't do this work alone.
Que su voz cuenta y que si nos unimos podemos lograr grandes cosas para nuestros hijos.
I love the diversity of the school district. Whether you know it or not, this district speaks 83 different languages.
To know that the administrative offices, they have my back. Not only my back, but they have my child's back.
Every child, regardless of...
To know that the administrative office.
All right, welcome to the August 21st meeting of the Folsom Cordova Unified School District Board of Education for our special study session on facilities. If you'll please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
A broadcast and recording is being made at the direction of the board, and the broadcast may capture images and sounds of those attending the meeting. Folsom Cordova Unified School District Board Policy 1313 promotes mutual respect, civility, and orderly conduct among employees, parents, and the public. We will treat staff, parents, and members of the public with respect and expect the same in return. If any member of the public uses obscenities or communicates in a demanding, loud, insulting, and or demeaning manner, the board will calmly and politely admonish the person to communicate civilly. Public comments during board meetings are an important component of public engagement and transparency. Members of the public will not be permitted to yield their speaking time to another member of the public. No comments were received by the 3 p.m. deadline today for written comments prior to the meeting. Per the Brown Act, the board is not allowed to enter into a two-way discussion on any matter that is not on the agenda. And since we have one matter on the agenda, that should probably be easy. So let's start with the roll call, please.
Yes, Mr. Melajor,
Here.
Mr. Merrill,
Here.
Mr. Clark,
Here.
Mr. Hui,
Here.
thank you, Ms. Larrett,
Here.
Mr. Reed,
Here.
and please note that Ms. Lofthouse is not able to join us tonight. Thank you.
All right. That takes us to adoption of the agenda. Do I have a motion?
I'll move.
Motion by Board Member Larrett. Is there a second?
I'll second.
A second by Board Member Melajor. Superintendent?
Yes, Mr. Melajor,
Aye.
Mr. Merrill,
Aye.
Mr. Clark,
Aye.
Mr. Hui,
Aye.
Ms. Larrett,
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Motion carries 4 and 1 is absent. Thank you.
All right, that takes us to item 3, discussion. Folsom Cordova Unified School District Board Study Session on Facilities. Superintendent?
Yes, thank you, President Reed. Tonight's study session is a result of a presentation that our staff made to the board at the May 18th meeting about an overview of our school facility improvement districts, our facility updates. And from that meeting, there was a request to go into more detail about our facilities program and the future of our SFID programs. So tonight's presentation will be covering facilities master planning, and information on SFID 4, 5, and 3. And I do want to thank our team from Folsom Cordova, Mr. Martin, Mr. Washburn, Ms. Wickham, and then our broader team of consultants that are joining us: Joanna Bose from KNN Financial, Terry Jameson from HMC Architects, and Mr. Charles Heath from Team Civics. So welcome as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin. Welcome.
Thank you. So this evening, we are going to spend an amazing 3 hours together going and navigating through all the world of facilities for Folsom Cordova. So tag teaming this will be all of the team members. They're also here to answer any questions that the board has. As you see, what we're first going to do is talk about facilities as a district-wide, kind of the processes that we use. Matt's going to speak to most of those areas. And we're also going to talk about some of the funding components that are available to us when it comes to facilities. And then we're going to dive into 3 areas specifically. We're going to talk about SFID 4, 5, and 3, and we're going to do it in that order because we want to first talk about current funding needs within regards to SFID 4 and 5, which is more or less the communities of Rancho Cordova and Folsom. And those are really our existing facilities. And then we're going to speak to SFID 3, which is the development south of Highway 50, east of Sunrise, which is our new development, and the outstanding bond Measure M on that project as well. So at this point, Matt's going to come over, give us some overview of the key pieces when it comes to how we do our planning, what are the standards that we use when it comes to facilities, and then we'll dive into also how the funding works for facilities. So, Mr. Washburn.
You want to click there? Good evening. So Sean kind of gave you the overall presentation. I'm going to kind of dive right into the first part, the district-wide facilities discussion, and I'm kicking that off with district-wide facilities master planning. Facilities master plan is basically, it's a collection of information, programs, policies, facilities, a bunch of data that a district uses for on a continuous basis to plan facilities. It's a live document, it's ongoing, it's a roadmap to basically assist the district in planning facilities, including all the educational programs, the types of facilities, the location of facilities, facilities improvements, needs. So it's basically a working document that can be referred to constantly as facility needs are brought up, as facilities needs are developed, whether it's new construction, modernization, demographics, tennis boundary changes, things like that. The facility master plan can help with that. A master plan should be updated every 5 to 10 years. Our last major facilities master plan was updated a little less than 10 years ago. We have also done master plans specifically for our SFID areas, for our bond programs, SFID 4 and 5 for measures G and N. We did specific facility plans for those SFIDs, which is very specific on the type of projects that were developed for those programs. The benefits of a master plan are, as you can see, you get an appraisal of your school, your conditions of your facility. What are the facility impacts by developing programs? There's various educational programs that impact educational facilities. And it's a comprehensive planning and financing of those facilities. Well, how are we going to finance them? And then it's a collection of all the information that goes into developing the master plan. School capacities, yield rates, proposed new residential development, the impact of that development on school construction facilities and where they go. Modernization needs in existing areas. What are the needs of those schools? How are they brought up to current standards and educational standards? And then funding and obviously revenue sources. Where's the revenue going to come from to pay for those facilities? It's not working here. Oh, there we go. California Department of Education recommends 9 content areas to be addressed. Statement of the purpose, what are the goals, objectives, purpose of the plan, involvement of the community, analysis of facilities, analysis of and description of educational program, intensive demographic study, that's really key to look at the demographic study, the long-term socioeconomic, the trends of the types of housing, what are the yield rates going to be, long-term, you use it for closing schools as well as building new schools. All different aspects of a master plan is used, and then you constantly evaluate the plan. Developing the master plan should include everybody. It should include students and parents and community members, local governmental agencies, parks and recreation, school district staff, and community-based organizations. We look at developing a master plan. We look at it as 2 phases, and they could be done simultaneously. The first part is the demographics, which includes all of the demographics. What's your existing capacity within your schools and your district? How many kids are you going to have in so many years? What is the yield rate? Working with developers on what their projections are for build out, constantly evaluating that, determine what the yields are for that, looking how many kids are coming through on the feeder districts, looking at your attendance boundaries. All those different components all go into it as far as determining how many facilities are needed where, and then also the priorities, the timelines, when are they going to be needed. Then assessment of the facilities is another key component. And that's something that we look at in more detail is what are the school facilities? What are the needs at those facilities? Physical, HVAC, roofing, asphalt. What is the adequacy of the facilities and the programs within those? Do they have enough small learning areas? Do they have enough collaboration areas? What are the kind of things that the existing facilities need as we develop the program through, and then how do we address those needs? That'll be another component of the master plan. And then also, as I mentioned, as we develop SFID areas and we develop bonds and programs, creating a specific plan for the projects and improvements within those SFIDs, because they're very specific to that planning area. Also mentioned further, we will be putting out an RFP for master plan services as well, working closely to develop these 2 phases of the master plan.
Now, I just wanted to share with the board, if you guys do have questions during the presentation, you can stop us. This is a study session, so definitely we can do the back and forth. I will say that if you're wanting to dive into specifics about the SFIDs, when we get to that area, that will probably be the right time for that area. Cool.
Are there any questions on the facility master planning portion? I would say, that 2013 facility master plan, I love that document. I can tell you I've looked it up probably on average of 3 times a year. It's a wealth of information. I assume that played a big role in the Measure G and how Measure G was being spent based on that 2013 master plan.
Yeah, absolutely, and I need to give kudos to my staff, Jerry and Joanne, everybody. They actually did that master plan and put that together, and so it's kudos to them. A lot of work goes into that, and also working closely with our consultants as well.
It definitely, in a way, is a historic snapshot because on it you also list, the date each facility was built and major improvements over the years. It really does speak like a timeline. I do have a couple of questions on this. So, how has the yield rates or even the building standards evolved over the past 10 years? Significantly, minor changes, major changes?
Well, that's kind of how things ebb and flow. Typically in the past, new development areas, we see their peak yield rates typically around 5 years. It's typically new growth areas where you have young families coming in, they're building homes, they start having kids, and then they start working their way through. San Jose Gallardo, we opened with 700 kids. It's a new growth area. We saw the Empire Ranch. We saw those areas, even in Navigator. It's a different phenomenon, and we're seeing south of 50. I think COVID has really changed a lot of things too. And what we're seeing south of 50 in Folsom was we're seeing more move-up people, maybe some coming from Bay Area, who already have families. As you can see by the yields coming out of south of 50 Folsom are a lot higher than we experience typically in new growth of brand new homes coming in. So it's actually having to take a look at it, make sure we're on top of that, because 2 years, Mangini was full. Wouldn't maybe normally take that long depending on how many homes are in development. So that's something you have to look at as far as yields, and then how does that impact the high school, middle school? Because new growth areas are, newly growth areas, you don't have a lot of growth at the high school, middle school level. So that impact is probably going to affect the high school, middle school earlier. But on the converse, we're seeing a slowdown in the existing areas because of the yield, or the birth rates are down in some of those areas. So some of those growth areas, we're seeing less kids at the elementary school are eventually going to work their way through the middle school and high school. So new growth area, high yield, older growth areas, some of the yields are down a little bit. So that's something that, and we do that yearly. We have to evaluate what those yields are. So it's a constant ebb and flow and evaluating and reviewing those.
I have to imagine, outside dynamics have a significant impact on yield rates, including, I assume you normally account that X percentage of a neighborhood turns over on a annual basis, where perhaps younger families replace older families. But with the historic increase in mortgage rates, I think probably people aren't moving as much as they were, which then probably messes your formula up, right?
Yeah, that's always the the unknowns is, the economy, what happens with that. I think what we're finding in, even talking with developers, I think the yield rate or the mortgage rates, the interest rates going up, I think people are still moving and are still buying. I think they're just banking on, it'll go down, I'll refinance in the future. But it hasn't seemed to slow down as much as I think we maybe thought it had been. Talking, you saw in the Business Journal today, I think said something about Folsom on the move or something, or Folsom continuing, something like that. But, I think the development seems to be pretty strong. I don't think the recession is bad as what maybe people thought it had been as far as affecting building growth. So right now it seems pretty steady, but we have to continue to watch our existing as well as the new areas too. And then, the available housing stock, that has a determination of it as well. We always have to look at the type of housing going in, if it's high density, medium density, because the type of housing affects the yield rate. Larger, more expensive homes typically yield less than some of the smaller, more affordable type homes.
And the last time we did the master plan, I guess this is more an FYI for the public, is prior to having TK or all-day kindergarten. So obviously that's going to impact all of our existing facilities.
And it's affected a lot because of the programs we have now. We have the same square footage, but we have less capacity because we have more programs. Right. Schools 20 years ago, you could put more kids in them because you didn't have all-day K, you didn't have TK. Our special ed's higher. We have intervention, more intervention programs now than we had back then. So there's a lot of programs that take up a lot more space than it did in the past. So our capacity is down at a school, or we have to build more square footage to have the same capacity, which ultimately drives up cost as well.
Will the facility master plan take into account changes in zoning that either Rancho Cordova or Folsom has entertained? I know Folsom right now is looking at identifying some high-density infill development areas in north of 50. I have to imagine if they do proceed in building these high-density infill developments, I think they're mostly apartment complexes. That potentially impacts existing facilities that we've already built.
Well, and that's a constant evaluation of what is going into a community or an area, and then what those yields will represent. We're currently working with somebody right now on looking at that. As we look at attendance boundary changes, we're looking at yields and the impact of that. So we'll look at that and say, some of the capacity, some of the growth has gone down a little bit. So some of those come in may supplant that or help, bring some of that maybe back where it was. So that's part of it, is you have to constantly evaluate the types of housing, the yields that come from it, and the available capacity to be able to house those kids within certain areas. And if the adjustments or attendance boundary changes are needed based on where those developments are going in, those are the kind of things we'll have to look at. And what a master plan will have to review as well. But that's why it's a kind of a live document, because at a point in time when you do something, it doesn't mean, next year something could change. So a constant update. That's why we do enrollment projections every year. We do yield studies every year, and we continue to look at where those kids are coming from and the impact of the new growth.
Okay. On page 5, just a comment on who should be involved in the facility master plan process. Can we get board representation added to that?
I think school district staff is inclusive of board.
Oh, inclusive. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. It'd be nice if we could get 1 or 2 board members on.
Yeah, there's a facility committee of a couple board members that would be a part of that.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a really quick question. Do we have a timeline on when that RFP is going to be coming for the master plan? Or are we anticipating it this year or next year? Or?
This year. We anticipate putting something out this year.
Okay.
A lot of us, depending on this study session and direction we're getting from everything, but that's something we need to do regardless of the outcome. And so we're already actually starting a component of that with some of our projections and demographics right now. So in a way, we actually have contracted for a component of that as we're working towards attendance boundaries. So a first portion of that is actually already underway.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on.
I have one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just thought of it. When we're talking about who should be involved in the FMP process, how does that come about? Do we have community meetings? How do we get these like community members and things like that involved? How does that typically go?
Most likely there'll be community forums. Some draft documents will be put together, information, and then there'll probably be feedback. We're asking feedback on what do you see, or what kind of components do you want to see in facility. I mean, it'll be pretty well rounded starting off, and then it'll kind of focus down onto it. And we're going to have a consultant help guide us through that process as far as the community process is, what type of information that we're seeking. Nowadays a lot of that stuff can be done online, surveys, or use some community forums in-house. So probably a combination of those things.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then moving on from facilities master planning is district educational facilities standards, and we also say educational specifications. Those components really drive what facilities are designed, the makeup of facilities. What you're seeing right here is based on what new schools. The new schools that we're building now are based on these standards and these specifications that have been approved. Some of them are set. Some of them are from the state that are required to do. Some of them are contracts we have with our associations, and some of them are based on board-approved guidelines. As you can see, the educational standards up there, you have the loading standards. The FCUSD basically follows our district contractual guidelines. And then the other one is the Office of Public School Construction, which is the agency that provides the funding for new schools through the statewide bond program. And they fund it on those formulas. So it's not exactly funded the way that we load our facilities. So as you can see, if you're loading a lot more kids based on what the state funds you, you're getting less money based on that funding formula. That's just how the state funds all the schools throughout the state. And you can see each one, we have one for special education, middle school and high school. So those are how we determine when we're loading our schools, we're building new schools. We determine how many kids, how many classrooms do we need, what kind of classrooms do we need, what kind of specialty rooms do we need. Those formulas are used to help dictate that. And as you can see in a high school, in middle school, it gets a little more complicated because you have science rooms and you have electives and you have CTE and you have VAPA programs. So it gets a little trickier at the high school determining what your load is. And it depends on, if you're an IB school, your loading standards also might be different too, because you may not be following the same loading standards as perhaps what you would normally if it was an IB school. Different schedules, a block schedule, you can't load as much as you can as a standard schedule. So there's a lot of caveats and nuances that go into determining these factors. And then going through, it determines the student capacity based on the loading standards, how many kids we have by how many teaching stations. We always like to build in extra capacity and flexibility, as you see, especially the elementary level. We always like to put in infrastructure for additional portable classrooms because we need that flexibility. You might need to grow a little bit before your next school is in, so you want to make sure you have that. It's a lot more cost efficient to put it in when you're building the school rather than trying to trench and put everything in later. High schools, you have a little more flexibility because you can do some hot seating and things like that to get some flexibility, so that provides a little bit more on that as well.
Matt, is a teaching station the same thing as a classroom, or is it different?
No, that's the same. Yeah, basically, teaching station is a classroom.
Okay.
We use these terms and vernacular that sometimes we forget to explain. And also, you can see we have more TK and K, so that's expanded the capacities. Alder Creek, which is under construction, we increased that 2 more classrooms that are a little larger classroom based on the TK and K needs at that school as well. And then you have your ancillary spaces that you have at all the schools, gyms, student services, fields, instructional areas as well. Any questions on that, or I'll go to the next?
Matt, can you describe go ahead on there. I just think it's important to recognize, like when we talk about the teaching stations and we talk about some of the things like classroom sizes, some of those things are defined by the state,
Yes.
whereas some we define right through our process when it comes to educational standards.
Yep.
Can you speak to those a little
I
bit?
do have a note right here, too.
Okay.
And Sean's right. Some of these things are defined by the state. I mean, we have guidelines that we have to follow for the site size, site location, recommended, things like that. We have, when we're planning schools, we have guidelines we have to follow. We have Title 24. We have electrification. We have, the classroom itself, the recommended for each program. They have recommendations for science. They have recommendations for regular classroom. They have recommendations based on the number of kids you have for serving areas and circulations. There's all kinds of different recommendations or requirements that we have. And it's more than it ever used to be. That's when schools cost more than it used to be. A lot of the requirements have increased. And we try to follow there's recommendations and then there's requirements, but most of the recommendations, they have to approve our plans. And if we don't provide something that meets the State Department of Ed recommended school, then we have to explain why we're deviating or why we're not, or make the correction for that.
And then, so for an example, though, as a district, if the standard requirement, state minimum would be 2 visual performing arts classrooms, but because of our programs in our community, we identified we want 4, or same thing with science wings, maybe we want, because of CTE and other programs, we want 3 extra science wings. That would be our educational standard that we have set as a district. So there is a minimum, and then there's what the district sets, right? And so that's part of that process when we're developing the master plan, and when we're developing all of these things is what is our standard as Folsom Cordova.
And that's important, and Sean mentioned the educational specification, because the educational specification is a link between the educational program and the school facility. So the school district may have an educational program that is different requirements than maybe what we would normally do, or school or a State Department of Education. Like Sean's saying, maybe we have more science, we have a robust science program, or maybe we have different VAPA needs, or we have different things. That's where the educational specification comes into play to develop the educational programs that go into designing the facilities. And so that's a big component that really drives these facilities.
Matt, prior to TK and all-day kindergarten, did we have a different number for the number of teaching stations for our elementary schools?
Yes, we've added at least 3 stations from what we had before.
So we used to be around
Like
24 teaching
Yes.
stations, okay.
So, I mean, you're talking, 3 you're at least 3,000 plus circulation, 4,000 square feet circulation, and you're up, $700 a square foot plus, and it over multiple sites, it starts adding up.
Okay. Tim, just feel free to chime in if you have a question.
So kind of taking that to the next step, this is more of our educational facility standards based on our educational specifications that we utilize when we're designing our current facilities. Currently we're looking at flexible spaces, student-centric, a lot more concentration on student socialization, small learning areas, and collaboration, developing more communication skills and building relationships. This is especially important after COVID, connections with these spaces. Obviously, technology is a big driver in how we design schools, because using technology, we can make the rooms more flexible. We can put technology in more locations. Transparency, greater sense of connection, and then, obviously the safety, both physical and mental safety of the students. Be able to provide that is, make sure the students feel safe in their environment, but also having safety features for physical safety for the campus as well. So these are all components that we have designed. This is part of the ed spec that was actually approved by the board. This being designing our current schools as we work through our elementary and middle and high schools.
Matt, do you find that it's a bit of a challenge when this is like our current standards, but we have a lot of legacy schools that aren't meeting these standards?
Absolutely, and that's, I think, what we need to do is, as we develop plans for existing schools, we try to put some of these components in that. We look at how do we bring those schools up to the same educational standard as our new schools. And a lot of them already have that, but I think we take it to the next level. How do we provide more of that, student-centric, small learning spaces, collaboration? Those are the kind of things that I think we look at as we're developing schools. Take some of those components into the existing schools and continue to do that. And we are doing it in some spots where we can, but obviously, there's a cost to that. So, safety, we've brought up safety, how we're doing it. We're talking about video surveillance and cameras. And so that's first and foremost, all schools, we're going to do that. And, it's just taken to the next step as we move forward. Taking it kind of to a further, more specific level, we also have performance and product standards when we're developing systems and we're developing schools. We like to we try to standardize as much as possible for many reasons. A lot of it is because we have maintenance and operations. We have folks that work on certain systems. We stock certain parts. So having people who work on systems similar, we don't have to contract out. If we have 20 different systems, we don't know, we can work on that. We still try to maintain a few standards. So we build in competition on how we do that. We have energy management systems. So they're online, they're controllable. We wouldn't want to have 4 different systems, 4 different controls. It becomes quite cumbersome. So a lot of these specifically, we have standards to help develop. It helps to save on cost too. We can buy in bulk. We have systems that have been developed before in previous schools, so we've worked the bugs out on that. So in the next one, we're bidding it. They already know the system. We already know the contractors, the subcontractors who can work on that. Some of the finishes are the same. So when you're not buying, materials that are different for each school site, you're trying to buy something that's the same. You have the same type of flooring, you have the same type of roofing, some of those materials. Furniture and equipment, we're trying to keep the same furniture equipment at multiple sites. So as site enrollment goes up and down, you have flexibility. You can move furniture back and forth. Buying large amounts of furniture in bulk is also a saving because we get a discount by buying a large amount of furniture at one time. We're also doing a lot more owner furnished, contractor installed because of timelines, long lead items. So having standardization on that. We were buying HVAC units earlier than just so we can meet timelines. So there's a lot of things that go into these factors right here. Also, we look at different procurement methods, how we can procure them to still maintain some of our competitiveness in the environment. We look at all different CMAS and multiple different funding formulas, competitive leaseback. We do different formulas. I'm going to move on unless there's any questions. I'm going to talk about value engineering and cost control. So value engineering, I'm sure you've heard that word. It's basically a function-oriented systematic team approach to providing value in a product, system, or service. And it's not necessarily just a concept, it's a methodology. And if you want to substitute material or a system or different building methods, these are all part of value engineering. We've always conducted value engineering in our projects all along. We continue to do that. As you can see, having value engineering early in the process has a larger net gain. Very early in the building process, when you're planning and developing, trying to determine methods and products, that's when you gain your most bang for your buck. In building systems and product and materials, life cycle costs, we're always looking at that. Something may cost more in the beginning, but you might save money in the long run. So those kind of things we look at. We looked at air conditioning systems, evaluate it for all of our building products. And then capital costs versus operational costs is kind of the same thing. We always look at that. We want to put something that's going to last. We don't want to end up taxing our operational dollars and our maintenance dollars by putting something that's not going to last 3 or 4 years. VE can be consulted by contractors, engineers, architects, or a third party. There's several different ways to conduct value engineering, and it's an ongoing and constant type of a process. Here's some real examples of how we have implemented value engineering. Mangini Ranch to Alder Creek during design, we had $3.4 million in savings. All of it was completed prior to Mangini. A lot of roofing design to make a more uniform roof design, window screens. You can see up there, there's quite a few changes that we made to get a $3.4 million in savings. And then during construction too, and working with the contractor, we also developed another $800,000 in savings as well. So this is just between Mangini Ranch to Alder Creek. The high school, we're also looking at doing that as well. It's ongoing. We've already reduced $23.5 million. We reduced the third floor. We reduced some volume. We changed the front entrance. So there's several changes, and it's not a one and done. This is a continuous effort. As we continue to move forward on these designs, we'll continue to do value engineering efforts.
Matt, on the value engineering that we've done up to date, is it internal or is it contracted out with an independent third party that does the value engineering?
Well, it's not it's internal as to we hire a contractor on it or through, it could be the architect, contractor thing. It's not that, which is a third party. It's not internal to the district, but it's not a completely third party who's not part of the process. So construction company or contractor may have a pre-construction side of the house where they do value engineering, constructability reviews, cost estimating, and then they'll have the construction side of the house that takes into the construction part. So they may have two different components. It's the same company, but two different components.
Why would we not want to have an independent third-party value engineering firm that is separate from the architect and the contractor? I just, like, for example, on page 10 or slide 10, it references canted walls back to 90-degree angles. Well, my first question is, why did we have canted walls to begin with? They're expensive. Shouldn't we have parameters that suggest to our architects that, we don't want these extra bells and whistles just because they look cool. We need to keep our costs down. Kind of the same thing with like the curved stairwell at the gym. I mean, why were we doing curved stairwell to begin with if it's more expensive? Or even at Mangini Ranch, the canted roof line or the roof line that's at various angles, that all adds additional costs. And while I'm glad we caught it for Alder Creek to create some savings, I sometimes wonder if we had an independent third-party value engineer separate from the architects and the contractors, the construction company, maybe we would have caught it even before we got into the planning and development stage. I don't know. I mean,
that's something we're entertaining doing that, and we're looking at actually hiring a third party. Yeah. And I think all parties would welcome that, including the architect. So I think that's something that we will look at doing as far as hiring a third-party value engineering firm moving forward on some of these designs and these projects to help assist that. I think another set of eyes can't hurt.
Okay, I have a quick question on the Folsom Ranch. What is our current student count at Vista? Do we have that number?
About 1777, I think, something around there.
Okay.
1750.
My biggest concern on that, I love saving money, is just reduced parking lot for the reduced capacity, because at Vista it can be challenging sometimes with the parking. So I just want to make sure that while we do want cost savings, that we do have those things that we do need, like the parking, because I've had to work to North Dallas 40,
Right.
to get to the school sometimes. So, just thought.
I have to tell you that the parking was reduced because of reducing some of the capacity, but the number of parking spaces is very high.
Perfect.
A lot of it because of that. As you know, students, first year they drive, they can't take anybody with them. That wasn't that way when we had Vista. So, and also where the planned Folsom Ranch High School is, there's no off-street parking, so we had to plan. So there's a considerable amount of parking percentage increase from what we had at Vista.
Yeah, perfect. And I'm just kind of thinking about some of our partners that come outside from the community and making sure that we've got those. And again, so it's good to know that we don't have that.
We just want to reduce it percentage-wise based on reducing the student count.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. ongoing value engineering, cost control going forward. Like I mentioned, one thing we always do is a post-occupancy evaluation. We have a post-occupancy evaluation draft that was going to go out to all the site staff at Mangini Ranch. And it's very in-depth questions, asking them, what works, what doesn't work, where can we do something more efficient, or, where can we save here, or what do you don't have that you wish you had. So it's a way to improve the program and perhaps be more efficient, or, some things they might want to ask for that we didn't provide, and those things we have to evaluate. But it's a good way to reduce costs. Also, things that we do is reusing of the plans, because once the plans have been done once or twice, then you have experience from that. You have less issues when you're developing next time, because a lot of those have been worked out during the construction process. So that's something that, as we fine-tune plans, cost can, you're not going to say, you're still got the construction cost, but you're going to save on some of the other unknown factors. Constantly reviewing our educational program and standards. That's where you are. Our educational standards and our specifications, they drive the facility program. We have to constantly look at that. Is there some way we can meet the educational program a different way? We have to, constantly look at that. One thing we're doing right now is we're studying design alternatives for the next elementary school to determine, can we still deliver the educational program in a different way than we're doing it now, to perhaps have some efficiencies in the cost in the program. We don't want to give up what we have, but at the same time, let's see how we can do that better. So it's forcing us to try to, not forcing us, we want to do it, but let's look at how we can meet the same program, but maybe have some efficiencies in what we're doing. And we'll learn from what we're building now and how we can move that on further. And like I said, it's continuous, ongoing. Contracting early, I think we do it early. Constructability reviews, another thing. Constructability review is actually a review of the plans themselves, make sure they're constructible. And then, as I mentioned, there it is, third party. You mentioned, and we're already talking about doing it.
But that's just for the high school. Could we have a value engineer that looks at all of our projects?
Absolutely, you could. Okay. I think it's your bang for the buck depending on the project. I mean, obviously you're going to do a small little project, your bang for the buck may be as much, but any size value of a project, if you can get some value out of it, I just know no reason why we wouldn't consider doing it.
Okay.
All right, with that, I think Sean's going to take over.
Thanks, Matt. All right, well, we're into the financing part of facilities and how we finance activities. There's a couple different options, and I won't lie, the very first one, when it comes to state building funds, I will defer to the expert Jerry over here with the little crown. Ooh, she knows all of those things. The very first thing I would say is there's really two state pots. There's new construction and modernization. And so modernization would be your existing campuses. As you can see there, at least 20 years old from the last time either the campus was built or modernized. Portables get, 25 years, portables get 20 years. So we get funding for that. And Jerry has lots and lots of spreadsheets that calculates all of that out and based off of student yields and other factors that determine that. On new construction, the big thing you want to see here is, you notice it says a 50% match. The reality, though, is they don't pay 50% of the project. They pay 50% of the formula that the state uses. And as you can see, just based off of some of those standards, the state doesn't fully fund the entire cost of a construction of new construction. So I think on average, we'd say it's about a third comes from state funding, about a third is district, about a third is developer fees, if all things are balanced, that three-legged stool. But of course, the state portion has to be funded by the state, which means they have to have enough money to do so. So for quite a while here, we've been waiting for reimbursement for projects, modernization, and both, and then new construction as well. I think we just got in money for Mangini, right? So it takes about 2 to 3 years, assuming the state has the money. And the state building program is running out of money. And so they are planning to go out for a bond in 2024 at the state level. And so we will need that bond to pass to then get our money for, say, Alder Creek and our modernization projects that we have throughout the district. So it's critical. And so that's kind of how the state program works. Modernization, I don't know how of the modernization funding, how much they really cover of a project. Depends on the eligibility of the particular campus, the timing, the scope of the project that you're wanting to do. But I would say this, that without passing a school bond, you really don't have the ability to do a modernization project because you're talking millions and millions of dollars, right? And so that's important to recognize that it's not as though we have funding in our general fund or our deferred maintenance pot to pay for these modernization projects. You really have to go out to your community. And that's intentionally so. Back when Governor Brown was here and they created the local control funding formula, one of the things they did was actually, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide, is they eliminated the state matching of dollars for deferred maintenance projects. So really, there is no facility funds allocated to school districts other than what the board takes action to allocate through the budget process. So if you want to do any kind of, other than the 3% routine maintenance, which is your year-to-year maintenance you have to do, but any deferred maintenance, big projects, has to be funded from either general fund or one of these other options here.
Hey, Sean?
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, just a quick question on the new construction for the state funding. Does that tie in with, on slide 6, the Office of Public School Construction Funding Standard?
Yes, it does. That's exactly what that's what the standard they use on how they fund. So they're only going to fund us for 25 students for every classroom.
Okay.
Off of a formula.
Would our classrooms have to match that ratio, or?
No, we do not. That's just the limit they fund us at.
Got it. Okay. So
yeah, it's just for fiscal allocation only, no other purposes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sean, when a facility undergoes modernization, once the modernization is complete, I take it the clock starts ticking again on another 25 years?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be eligible for re-modernization for another 25?
Correct. And so sometimes it's tiered because you added some portables.
Right.
10 years after the school started, maybe you pulled your mod dollars to do a mod on the campus, but you didn't pull it for all the classrooms or the gymnasium. And so however the funding mechanism works, it just depends on each school site. That's why Jerry has spreadsheet upon spreadsheet, knowing where every project is and when they'll become available for modernization money, those types of things. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You got it. So that's on the state side. On the local side, really meaning more or less the school district side, these are kind of the options to bring revenues in for facilities. One is general obligation. That's the Prop 39 bonds at this point. Most districts do the Prop 39, which is a standard 55% pass that requires, it caps us at $60 per $100,000 assessed value. We can go up to that level. It requires us to have an oversight committee that reviews all of our projects to ensure that our projects fall within the scope of the bond language, all of those pieces. And those are pretty much what most districts use at this point to fund facility projects within their district. Developer fees, we talked about that. That's something that comes to the board annually. That's collection for new construction, or I think it's over 500 square feet on a build on an existing home. They have to then more or less pay fees to the district because of the impact of building that. We have a formula that comes along with that. Certificate of participation is really more of a component of debt that allows us to get cash flow for future tax receipts. So we only normally use a COP in a situation where maybe we need to do the project now, we don't have the money available because we can't issue the bonds or whatever the case may be, or we're waiting on the state to fund us. And so we use this as kind of a bridge, more or less a loan or a line of credit that allows us to do the project now and then pay it off in a future date. So you normally use that as a kind of a debt instrument along with other funding sources. This doesn't actually pay for anything on its own. It's really more or less you're borrowing money, or it's like a credit card that allows you to do something now. So maybe you get a better price point, or you're able to complete a project and then you pay it off in a future date. Melrose, we don't have any Melrose, so you're probably familiar with that. There is some communities down in Elk Grove, they have Melrose. El Dorado County, there's Melrose. That's where they do collect taxes for normally a certain amount of time on each home. And that's paid by the homeowner versus developer fees is normally paid by the developer. And so it's a different method, and then it's normally paying for a specific project or activity, depending on how the language is written out. But we don't have any of those in our district.
Who approves Melrose?
So normally it's the developer that would bring it forward to the district and say, instead of me paying, the developer fees, we'd like to create a Melrose area and tax for a future school or whatever, a bridge or whatever it may be, because it's not just school districts that use Melrose. It can be used for different purposes. But normally it's the owner of the property. So normally it would be very hard to put a Melrose on a community of 1,000 homes. They're normally not going to file a Melrose on their own behalf unless maybe there's a need as a group. But for the most part, it's normally when a developer is building out and they're designing or developing that land and they say, you know, we're going to have 500 homes here. I'm the developer. I agree. And they create an agreement with the district and we agree on a tax rate or a collection amount to meet the future facility needs of that community. And then therefore, as a district, we waive our developer fee collection in lieu of Melrose.
Perhaps a silly question. Why do developers generally favor developer fees over Melrose?
That I think Melrose was a popular method. I don't feel like recently that has been as popular of an issue. I would defer developers. I don't know, Matt, if you have some reasons for it. I think there is a component of the developer fee, is passed on right at the beginning. It's a one-time fee, whereas the Melrose is for up to 30 years potentially. I think it can even go longer than that as a collection. And so as a homeowner, if it's just absorbed into the price that you purchase it, it's probably more appealing to you than knowing every year I see my tax bill and I have to pay X amount of dollars. So
okay.
That's more kind of just anecdotal, but we don't see developers reaching out to us and asking us to do that at this point. At least we haven't. Developer fees have been the traditional method for Folsom Cordova. I came from Rescue School District that was actually in a Melrose with the high school district and Buckeye School District over the Serrano area, and there was a lot of angst about that tax and some components. Now that was a Melrose that was established prior to some laws that changed, and so there wasn't an end date to that Melrose. And the language was pretty loose. So I think they've tightened that down quite a bit since then. But still, I think they're probably, if anybody lives in El Dorado Hills and Serrano, would probably say that they have lots of questions regarding that. So. Parcel tax, it could be used for facilities, but the truth is I've only seen parcel taxes used normally to support the educational side because you could go out for a general obligation bond. Parcel tax is normally a tax, an annualized tax, and I forget how many years you can go, but it's not you can't get the same access to the dollars that you can with a general obligation bond. So normally you don't see a parcel tax for facilities, but you could. It is an option. It does require a 2/3 vote. Normally you see it supporting communities that want to maybe expand a program or pay for a service, and the community is willing to pay that extra amount. And then the last one is sale of surplus property. Recently, we've had the sale of Granite Center, the old district office location. So we've had those dollars surplused and used put in the fund accounts. So that is some facility funds we have. But of course, that's a one-time allocation, recouping. A lot of times, though, when we sell property, as a school district, there are specific requirements. If it's a facility that has an existing school site on it, or a park, or a playground or a field, we have a very specific, and I'm forgetting what it's called, but there's a very specific process. We have to go through a 7-Eleven committee. It can only be, first it has to be sold to potentially another government entity for fair market value. So there's a lot more involved in it. It's not as though, I actually sold a lake in my last district. I sold Bass Lake, believe it or not. And so we went through that process, and you would think a lake with some nice property would go for a lot, but of course, because of zoning and the requirements that we had, we sold it to the Parks District at a very, very fair price to them. So it's not as though, we could just take, if Vista is a beautiful location, you could probably put quite a few homes there. But the truth is if we ever wanted to turn it into homes, we would not have the ability to do that, at least by selling it out through a sales option. So we're pretty limited as a government entity on that. So.
I have a quick question on this.
Sure.
Oh, the surplus property. So once we sell those and they go into our funds, and we're when we go to use those, does the board have oversight of that, or are we?
They have oversight of all of our funds. So really what happens with facility sales, it goes normally back to the source of it. So if we used bond proceeds to, which we actually did, so Measure M purchased some land over off of Sunrise that we were going to make as a maintenance yard, and it didn't work out for us. We went ahead and sold that. The money that was recouped from that, plus the gain, all of that went back into Measure M. So it goes back. So really, it falls back under the regulations of Measure M and all the bond requirements of that. The old district office location, it wasn't a lot of money, but the money that we were, a couple $1 million, I think relative to facilities, $1 million is a lot of money. It just relative to, a $750 million bond. But on that project, those are we really never didn't have any ongoing maintenance dollars for this ESC. So like the dais change here and some of those things, those are being used. Those dollars are being used for upkeep of the ESC building. But yeah, if the board wanted to direct those dollars to some specific activity, as long as it fell into whatever the requirements were of how the dollars were originally used to pay for those activities, yeah, that's allowable.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions about this component of the financing?
Yeah, Sean, I had a
Chris.
quick question, Mr.
Sure.
President, if I may. You talked about Melrose and the build out, and I'm kind of curious about the build out of Rio del Oro. I mean, do you foresee that maybe being a Melrose, or is that going to be more?
At this point, none of the developers have reached out to us.
Okay.
They've all gone with the developer fee site. Most of Rio del Oro is going to be developed by Aerojet.
Right.
At this point, we don't know if their plan is to sell off or they're going to develop it themselves. That would be 80% of that Rio, right? 70% of Rio del Oro is about. Yeah.
Is okay.
And then the rest is Elliott, Harry Elliott's Elliott Homes, and so they normally do the traditional way of developer fees.
Okay, thank you. I'm just kind of curious on which direction that may go.
Yep, you got it. And so on the next slide, we're going to talk about. We can do it. There it goes. Thank you. The other funding sources that we have. So the only other funding source, and this is more or less an allocation out of our general fund, is our routine repair maintenance account. So we are required to be able to access the state funds. We're required that annually that we take 3% of our whatever our budget is, our total expenditures for the general fund, excluding a couple of specialty accounts, COVID dollars, some things like that. We're required to then take 3% and put that into a fund that will maintain our facilities. Now, first and foremost, this is not enough money to maintain our facilities. This is money really to do what they consider routine maintenance. So making sure your existing HVAC is working, changing out air filters, maybe patching the roof, or maybe a replacement here or there. But when it comes to a wholesale need of a modernization of a campus, those types of projects, we defer over what's called deferred maintenance. And even this program has always been underfunded, but at one time, the state used to give us an allocation of deferred maintenance dollars. And then we were required to match that money. So we were matched those pots. Right now, we have kind of kept that up and going. We contribute about $600,000 or so from the general fund as part of the LCFF calculation. We kept an allocation going. We contribute about $600,000 to deferred maintenance. Then we transfer about $600,000 of our routine maintenance as the match, just kind of keep things status quo. So we put about $1.2 million in our deferred maintenance pot. But the truth is Jim Bonovich, who is our maintenance director, did an analysis. And when we talk about a 25-year replacement cycle, we're talking about all things on a campus. So we're talking about roofs, we're talking about siding or painting, we're talking about asphalt, bathrooms, plumbing, upgrading the facilities, right, with a 25-year cycle. So carpets are maybe 10, 15 years. Roofs are 25. Maybe you can get more if it's a metal roof, that type of thing. But on average, to do that, and Jim just used ballpark numbers. We used to do this. It's called a 5-year deferred maintenance plan. What is the next 5 years? On average, we would need about $5.6 million, and that's probably not escalated up enough. The truth is, because year-over-year costs jump significantly. What's that? Yeah, 5% per year. Yeah, Yeah, that $5.6 million is every year, and we're contributing $1.2 million. So you can see right there, just to stay on top of all of the district carpets and roofs and all of those things, we would need to contribute another $4 million annually just to this pot. And then it would need to be inflated every year. You know, we had a double-digit increase in construction costs the last few years, right? So you would then need to increase it correspondingly. And so this is a perfect example of why you have to use school bonds. You have to go out and get additional funding. Because I think if we were to take $4 million from the budget and allocate it to, that's great, but we also have needs of staff, needs of programs, needs all the other pieces. And we have a budget right now that is actually in a deficit. And so this would just obviously add to it. And this is ongoing. And so this just, it really reflects the idea that there isn't really that much money district-wide. And now realize also this money is specifically tied to our expenditures and our enrollment. So it's our local money, our local control funding formula money that we're putting into a pot that then correspondingly is needing to pay for this work. So as enrollment declines or flats, we see less LCFF dollars potentially, and then therefore correspondingly we get less dollars here. So it's important to realize that this pot is not sufficient to the needs of the district, and that's why we have to go out to bonds. And and that's what we're going to dive into here in a minute about the needs and what it looks like to go out for bond. In fact, I think the next slide we're going to jump into. Yeah, go ahead. Questions.
Before we go to that next slide, so you're talking about money that the district's putting away that comes from LCFF, I think. I think we receive some funding from things like the cell phone towers that go toward maintenance. Are there other pots that we pick from to do the maintenance?
The only other pot, so we have facility use fees. So we do get fees related to the facility use. That pays for the staff that collects the fees, and then the remaining amount of that, along with the cell towers, we have in a pot that is specifically we use to support normally the facilities that are used. So those are going to help normally go towards the sports facilities, the theater. Those are normally your biggest, and the gymnasium maybe. Those are the biggest areas that those go towards. So, but again, those are not even close to the cost for a new track or to replace out the bleachers, or we were able to do things like maybe the theater, the entranceway to the gymnasium or theater. We're modernizing that a little bit, and that might be able to cover some of that cost. But a lot of times that's in conjunction with other pots. I'm sorry, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're, if I'm understanding it right, that like the cell phone towers, that just supplements to a certain degree the funding that's necessary for those things.
Yeah, and the cell phone towers, we used to receive a significant portion of dollars back in the day, but and since I've been here, I think 3 or 4 of our towers actually they've expired their contracts and they're pulling out. So I think the technology is changing on that. They're not needing the lights on the gymnasium, on the top anymore. They have smaller repeater systems. They don't need those big giant towers like they used to, or they're finding more efficient ways, I guess, to offer that service. So we're seeing, in fact, I think over the summer, Cordova High, they were pulling out the unit at Cordova High that was over there, over there as well. I saw the equipment being pulled during back to school. Yep. Yeah. Yep. And Matt was sharing as we spoke to was that the cell towers were specifically with regards, because they were on the stadiums, we were using them to support the stadiums for quite a few years. But again, that dollar is dwindling out. Facility use has been a big ticket item, especially when we had a church at like Folsom High. We had a lot of collection there. We have obviously all the community organizations. We charge them at a reduced rate depending if they're a nonprofit or not, or how they use it. But the truth is that isn't really a money-making endeavor for us. That's normally covering the extra custodial, the utilities, those kind of types of things that go along with having our facilities open to the public. And so we don't really recoup that unless it's a true for-profit entity, and then we can charge the higher rate because we have a tiered rate system for facility use. So, any other questions about the funding? All right, so at this point, we're gonna have Charles come up here. He's gonna introduce himself, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about bonds and timeline, and then kind of, I know polling was a question about what are the kind of the next steps. So, all right, thanks, Charles.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Charles Heath. I'm a partner with a firm called Team Civics. We are strategy and communications consultants that work with school districts all over California that are contemplating going to their community and asking for voter support for a bond measure. As has been mentioned a couple of times, voter-approved bond measures are the primary mechanism by which schools fund facility improvements and expansion. Of course, since it does require voter approval, my job is to help manage the process with the district, to engage with the community, and help understand if there is sufficient community support for a bond measure. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process that we go through as we prepare for a bond measure, kind of the timeline, the steps required in order to be ready to go. I served as a consultant on your last two bond measures, the 2012 Measure P bond in the Rancho Cordova area and the 2014 Measure G bond in the Folsom area. So we do have some experience here in your district. Both measures were approved by about 70% of voters. The way we go about our process is we start at the big picture level, trying to understand, is it feasible to pass a bond in the current environment? The answer to that question isn't always yes. By feasible, I mean if we put a measure on the ballot, does it stand a reasonable chance of being approved by 55% of voters? That's the threshold required for success. And if the answer is yes, then what does that measure look like? What's the bond amount that we think voters will support? What's the associated tax rate? What are the project priorities that people want to see their tax dollars going towards? What's the right timing? What's the right election date? All those key strategic questions that you go to in order to develop a successful strategy. If we find that we have a viable measure and we've identified an election date that we want to move towards, then the next step in the process is to help you tell your story to the community. What are the facility needs that you've identified? That is usually an outgrowth of the master planning process that we were talking about. Voters typically want to understand how have past bond proceeds been used? Aren't we already paying for these projects? What did those bond dollars deliver? And what additional needs remain? So going through that process is the lead up to the board voting to place a measure on the ballot and preparing for a successful election. A question that I'm getting a lot when I'm talking to school districts about potential bond measures is, given the pandemic, given the economic uncertainty, given the challenges in the political environment, what has the passage rate been for bond measures? I prepared this table here that summarizes the passage rate for school bond measures over about the last decade. And you can see that pretty consistently, bond measures have been approved at 70% plus rate, right? 7 out of 10 measures that go to the ballot are successful. There's one outlier as you look down that list. In March of 2020, only about a third of school bond measures that were on the ballot were successful. And certainly on that election night, a lot of us were left scratching our heads trying to figure out, is this a new trend that we need to be concerned about? With the benefit of hindsight, that election was clearly the COVID election, where about 2 weeks before Election Day, the realities of COVID started to set in. People had questions about, what does this mean for my job? What does this mean about my kids going to school? What does this mean for the economy? And when voters are uncertain, the reaction is typically to sort of hunker down and be more conservative, and the conservative vote is a no vote. So the interesting thing is, within a few months, in November of 2020, when we were really in the midst of COVID and kids weren't going to classrooms and the sort of economic landscape had changed, voters had had enough time to adjust to the new landscape that they reverted back to the traditional passage rates. And since then, in the latter half of 2020 and in 2022, we saw the trend revert to the historical norm. So if you go through an appropriate planning process, you put a proposal before voters that is in alignment with their priorities, we're seeing these measures pass at strong rates. So looking ahead at the timeline for a potential bond measure, Prop 39 was mentioned earlier. That's the law that changed in the year 2000 that lowered the threshold from a 2/3 passage rate for bond measures down to 55%, which was a huge boon that allowed a lot of bond measures to pass that just wouldn't have been viable at the old 2/3 passage rate. But Prop 39 also had some strings attached. As was mentioned earlier, you have to have some additional fiscal accountability protections built in. There's a limit on the tax rate that you can ask voters to approve. You have to have a project list that details how the funds will be spent. But it also limits the election dates when you can put a bond measure on the ballot. So basically, Prop 39 bonds that can be passed at 55% have to go to the ballot at the same time as your regularly scheduled primary and general elections every 2 years. So that means in 2024, we have the March primary coming up. We also have the November general election that's available for a bond measure. And then in 26, we'll also have opportunities. The statewide primary will be in June. And then also the November 2026, sorry, that says presidential general election, but that should say gubernatorial. So those are the dates that are available to put a measure on the ballot. Obviously, when you're contemplating putting a measure on any of those ballots, you have to think about what else is on the ballot that could be influencing voters, what's expected voter turnout. All of that goes into the analysis of which is the optimal election date. There's also a reality in terms of the planning timeline that's necessary to be ready for one of those election dates. And you'll see in parentheses next to each of those election dates, 88 days prior to that election is the deadline by which the county registrar of voters needs to receive an adopted resolution from the school district calling for that election. So we have to back up basically 3 months before any election day, and that's when we have to have all of the details of our measure in terms of the bond amount, the tax rate, the project list, all of those details settled and ready to go to the public and then enter into a bond campaign. So thinking about the March 5th primary next year with a deadline of December 8th, those deadlines are sneaking up on us. That's probably not realistic given that you're just starting your master planning process, but certainly November of 2024 and the election dates in 2026 are certainly viable and allow for an adequate planning timeline. So through that planning process, what are some of the key strategic questions we're asking? Election timing, again, what else is on the ballot? What's voter turnout going to be? What other competing issues might there be out there that we want to consider? What's the size and scale of a bond that we think voters are going to support? And what are those project priorities? The mechanism that we use to answer most of those strategic questions is the first step in our process, which is the feasibility study. And the centerpiece of that feasibility study is public opinion research that we conduct among the voters in your community. We could all guess at what the voters' priorities are. We could guess at what size bond they might approve, or we can ask them. And we can conduct a poll in a statistically reliable way where we draw a representative sample of your voters. We ask them a series of carefully crafted questions in order to present potential bond options, potential facility needs that you have, and to gather reliable data that helps us make those decisions. So that's where we start. Through consultation with the district, we would develop that survey questionnaire, conduct that survey, and then bring the results back to you along with some recommendations. And we do that fairly early in the process so that we know up front, is this viable, and what are sort of the parameters within which we have to live if we want this measure to be successful. If coming out of that process, we feel like we have a viable proposal, then the next step is awareness building, right? Almost certainly one of the findings from that survey process will be there's a relatively low level of understanding of your facility needs in the public currently, right? Maybe a little bit different here because of growth and some other issues, but typically that's what we find. Typically about 3/4 of the voters in any community don't have school-age children just because of the demographic realities of the makeup of the electorate. So all those non-parent voters that aren't visiting your schools on a regular basis, right, they need to understand what your needs are. So we build that awareness through a community outreach process. So school districts, like all public agencies, are prohibited from advocating for the passage of a ballot measure, but you can educate and inform the community. So we put together non-advocacy communications that talks about the age of your facilities, the needs of your facilities, what a bond measure might fund, so that voters in the community understand that backstory about why this proposal is coming forward. Concurrent to that process, then we're also taking what we're hearing from that community outreach process and also what we've learned from your voter survey to develop the proposal for the ballot, right? We want to make sure that the project list and the details of the proposal are aligning closely with what we know about the community's priorities. So all of that comes together in the form of the resolution, which contains all the details of the bond proposal that you would be putting before voters. That comes before the board. If you approve that, then that's what calls for the election. And that's the action that needs to take place at least 88 days before election day. And sorry.
Yeah, quick question. Do you find, or is there statistics out there that indicate that individuals that do not have school-aged children tend to vote against bonds?
Certainly the support levels tend to be lower. So, and we, in the polling process, we analyze support levels by all different demographic groups, right? Parent, non-parent, partisanship, age, where they live geographically within the district. And typically, I mean, it stands to reason that if you have school-age children, you're directly invested in the schools. You're probably invested in the community as well, and so you're more likely to support the measure. But it's not as though non-parents are 0% support, right? They're just marginally below. And typically you can change that with some educational outreach to that community to make sure they understand the needs, how that connects to quality of life, how that connects to property values, so that they see value in it, even if they don't have kids in the schools.
Thank you.
Yep. So I was talking about once the board adopts the resolution calling for the bond election, that's an important transition point in the process. As I mentioned earlier, no public funds can be used to advocate for the passage of the bond. So the district can plan and prepare the measure for the ballot, but once it's on the ballot, any advocacy in favor of the measure needs to be privately funded and independently coordinated, not using any district resources. So what we've done here in your past elections is we identify parents, teachers, school employees, other folks that care about the schools to form an independent campaign committee, raise some private dollars, recruit some volunteers in order to run the advocacy campaign for that roughly final 3 months before Election Day. The polling that we do on the front end will tell us what level of support we start with. That'll help us understand how aggressive an advocacy campaign is necessary. But typically, especially in the current economic environment, a fairly aggressive campaign is necessary to be successful. So as you're making decisions about putting a measure on the ballot, you also want to know that there's community support there to help support that process once the district has to step into the background for that advocacy phase of the work.
I know this is probably all over the place, but what is the typical dollar amount to run a campaign like that? Or do you have like a range?
Well, we're talking here about 2 potential SFIDs, which are of different sizes. And so fundamentally, it's a matter of the number of registered voters and likely voters that you need to reach in that process. I'd have to go back and look at what we spent in our last 2 campaigns, but it's not uncommon for that to be, a $7,500, $1,000 campaign. Direct mail, digital advertising, lawn signs, all the stuff you all are familiar with in electoral campaigns.
But it should be noted that that's not funding. The only cost that the district would have would be the survey component at the beginning. The rest would be paid through that. That campaign would fundraise for those.
Yeah, none of those costs are eligible for public funds. So that's the overview of the timeline and process that I have. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have a question. Maybe you can share with the board. With the campaign, what amount of time when it comes to supporting the campaign does it normally take with regards to board? Because obviously we all need to be active in that to support that. Now that's outside of the workday, obviously, but
sure.
Can you speak to that a little bit? So we have an idea of the amount of time and effort. I've gone through a couple campaigns, so I just was wanting to make sure everybody kind of understood that.
Sure. It's a significant undertaking, right? And there's, typically hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. So you don't want to take it lightly. I think in terms of time commitment, we have to put everyone in 2 categories. District employees, right? They're full-time employees of the district. Their time when they're on the clock as an employee is a public resource. And so none of that time can be used to benefit the campaign or the advocacy effort. So that has to be after hours. Typically, we find that those folks, administrators that are involved in the facility program, they have a vested interest in this. They will volunteer after hours for that. The way we try to structure those campaign committees is to, spread the work among a broad group of people. So that's where pulling in parent leaders, teachers, staff, other folks that support the effort is critical. Board members, interestingly, you're not full-time employees of the district, so your time is more flexible. So oftentimes we'll have, at least a couple of board members that are actively engaged in that campaign process because you don't have that same on-the-clock, off-the-clock restriction in terms of how you utilize your time. Specifically number of hours a week, it's hard to estimate. That varies pretty dramatically from campaign to campaign.
And how far in advance of that do you recommend that we start that campaign?
Well, up front, if we do our survey research and we find that this is viable and we have a target election date, let's say that's November 2024, just for the sake of conversation, then 3 months before that is when we're going to put the measure on the ballot. I'd say at least a couple months before that is when you want that group coming together, getting organized, starting to raise resources so that there's a smooth passing of the baton from the district planning effort to that campaign when you get to that point of calling the election.
Thank you.
All righty. So at this point now, we're hopping into now some specifics. We're going to be looking at 3 SFIDs. If you remember, SFID 1 and 2 at this point are more or less kind of aging out, phasing out. We have remaining debt service we're paying on those, but those were borders based off of the old boundaries between Cordova High and Folsom High when there was only Cordova and Folsom High. And so when we created SFID 3, which was the south of 50 because of that new development, we then created SFID 4 and 5, 4 of the Rancho Cordova community, 5 on the Folsom side, right, of more or less our existing facility area. So we're going to jump into SFID 4. And so it's important to recognize that, you know, the way we have it broken out, because we have it in separate SFIDs, each area has its own bond, and each area has its own expenditures, its own master plan that we were talking about. And so the two do not mix. And same with our developer fees. When we collect developer fees, we separate the Rancho Cordova developer fees from the Folsom developer fees for the purpose of the same thing. So ensuring that component stays within that portion of the community. So,
Sean, before you begin, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Between SFID 3, 4, and 5, none of those 3 overlap,
correct? That is correct. Okay. Yeah. Now, 3 does encapsulate both Rancho Cordova and Folsom. Right. But yeah, SFID 4 and 5 don't overlap in the 3, and 4 doesn't touch 5. They don't overlap each other. Yes, that's correct. And so the next couple slides, you guys saw this back in, I think it was May. We presented this information, and Joanna and Danielle, they worked on creating all of this. And you can see the map up in the corner. But really, again, this is covering the existing Rancho Cordova community, everything west of Sunrise, more or less, of that area. And again, this doesn't match up perfectly with the city of Rancho Cordova because the city incorporates a different area. They go into Elk Grove. Antitoli is not even in our district, those types of things. And what it shows you is our assessed value rate, which is very key. So our assessed value is the tax rate within that area. And that is what, more or less, that is what helps caps us on how much we can access dollar-wise. And so one of the things you will see is the assessed value rate for the area of SFID 5 is larger than SFID 4. So for the same dollar amount, you're going to get a bigger total amount because of the fact that the assessed value is so much smaller in SFID 4 and 5, right? And so something we have to keep in mind when we're kind of doing these analysis. So this next page, at the last meeting, again, we gave you a detailed summary of all the projects that were done with each of the SFIDs and the projects with the measures. Now, we have 2 measures that have been passed under SFID for N and P, and we talked about the fact that measure N, because of the tax rate, we're not able to access the remaining authorization on that. And that's why P was generated to access additional money to complete projects. But you can see combined with all the other funds that we received, including you can see some funds from City of Rancho Cordova, state funding, other funds. You can see that we have about $150 million that we accessed. And at this point, through end of 22, 23, and some projects that are still pending, that's what the some of the encumbered areas are. We have a little under $500,000 left. And you can see that money is remaining for some work at Cordova High and Cordova Gardens. But the truth of the matter is once that money is depleted, there really is no money to complete Rancho Cordova projects other than that $1.2 million, which is district-wide, our maintenance projects, for maintenance projects. And so...
Can we just go back really quick?
Sure, of course.
Slide. Do we have a time frame on those remaining projects, like the stadium restrooms, of when we're going to be working on that?
No, we just recently bid the theater project, so we're getting into that project, and once we get into the planning of that, then we'll start working on the restrooms and the rest of those projects. So if we get to it in time, we may be able to do some of that next summer. The lobby for sure, and the rest of it we'll have to look at, but hopefully we can get some of that done next year.
The only reason why I'm asking you is just as we've talked through the bonds, and I know when we talked about the bond, that possibility of that grand entrance, and I know the bathroom's kind of sitting right where that grand entrance would be, so I don't know if we're thinking that we want to do that project right now, or if we want to finish this discussion first.
Right, that's kind of a discussion, and some of this all kind of plays into the big picture as well.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you.
Yep, you got it.
Just, Sean.
Yeah.
Kind of curious. I thought we had a board meeting where we were discussing the work being done at Cordova Gardens, and I thought everything was complete. What remains? Is it just the kitchen, or?
So Cordova, all the rounds of modernization we did at in Ranch Cordova, we did a couple different phases. One of the last phases, we did some interior landscaping projects. Cordova Gardens, we didn't finish all of the interior landscape. We did some front, we did some improvements in the front area, but there were some areas in the interior that we have to go back and finish. And then there are some improvements to the kitchen area as well that we want to finish as well. So between those are the two left at Cordova Gardens.
Okay.
Good. And on the next slide, we have a significant list of, and this is just a quick overview. Obviously, when we would do a facility master plan for SFID4, these things would be detailed out by school site with specifics, all of those pieces, right? But I think the intent of this, though, is to really drive home the idea that the needs are significant, both sides of the community, both SFIDs, and the reality is that even with the dollars that are probably available to us, they're not sufficient to meet all the needs, and that's why prioritization of projects and all of those things will come into play as well. And so we had this slide created. Again, this is information from May, I believe, and if we wanted to go forward and go out for a bond and maximize the Prop 39 level, which is $60, that's the maximum per $100,000 of assessed value, you can see there over 4 issuances we could get about $146 million. Now, there are ways to work on how the issuances work. If we needed more up front, more on the back, it could potentially give you a different dollar amount. But this gives you kind of a general idea. If we were to do 4 kind of even consistent issuances, this is where we would get. Now realize in 2033, 34, $36 million is not the same as $36 million in 2024, right? Just you've seen the value of cost and inflation. Everybody's familiar with those terms now. The other thing that to keep in mind is that there are different ways to divvy up the debt associated with it. Also, there's assumptions in there based off of what we think the growth of assessed value. That's a big piece because you're talking over, 30, 40 years of all of this debt service. And so if the AV, the assessed value rate, goes up at a higher rate than the rate that we assume, then what do we have? 3% for 23, 24, and then 3.5%. So if it averages 5, 6%, then potentially maybe you could access those funds sooner because of the way the AV has increased, and you can get up to that $60 and access more funds. So that's something that, that's what we work with Joanna on, and we tried how we structure our debt. You can also see there, I think we've talked about CABs versus current interest bonds. With CABs, we're a structure where you pay nothing but interest, or you have no payments for a certain period of time, and then you have potentially large principal payments at the end, which does increase, obviously, the debt on that. But there are times where that's an appropriate structure. But we did not include that in here at all. We would review that with the board, go over those components, because there is obviously an impact on the amount that has to be paid on that on the out years.
Sean, 146 million, I mean, obviously, it seems like a lot of money, except for, isn't that essentially equivalent to 2 Manjay Ranch elementary schools?
Equivalent. Now, you're modernizing here on these campuses. If you were going to try to build a new one.
You don't have the expense of acquiring the property.
Right. So there are some pieces, but, I think people have to realize also, a lot of times when I speak to community members, they often say, well, I could have built that for X. Right. But we also pay prevailing wage. And, obviously we have standards. The only entity that has a higher standard when it comes to building construction than us are hospitals. right? And so we have a very high standard of, things like load capacities and weight, all of these things. I know in my old district, we had 100-pound snow load capacity for our buildings, right? You start adding these things in, the engineering and the components necessary, the fire life safety systems that we have to put in, and all of the pieces that come with our, and now we have, is it what's the energy one? Title 24, which is the green energy systems that we have to ensure. And so when you start adding those things in, our facilities are significantly more than a private home or a private building potentially. So, and that is, a piece. And then keep in mind, that's $36 million, but spread out over, 10 years. Right, so what you're getting in the first year is not always what you get in the fourth year. And again, these dollars would only be dedicated within the SFID 4, which would be the Rancho Cordova site. So creating that master facility plan would be critical in that, to know what the priorities are. And then that's where we also look at what modernization availability is, right? Because if we can use state matching funds to do a project, one of the things you often see is if we phase things, that everybody knows, if you do 2 phases of something, it's going to add a premium to that project over doing it all at once. But at the same time, you may not have enough money. If the project's $50 million, you may have to phase it in 2 phases or 3 phases. And so then automatically, 2 years down the road, plus all of the requirements to rebid that project and get all of the work out there, it adds another $5-10 million to a project. So we try to, the further out that we can know how much money we have, the better the team can design the projects to maximize the dollars we have. So right now we're in a situation where, for example, we might have a project that we're working on right now with the dollars that we have, but we haven't passed a bond. And if we had extra money, we could do maybe 2 other classrooms or do another wing all at the same time and end up saving $500,000 or $1 million on the project. But unfortunately, because we have to wait until we know we've passed that bond, we have to break it up into multiple phases. So those are things we can be more efficient about as well if we do that.
I guess a practical question is, if we wanted to replace one of our existing facilities, hypothetically in Rancho Cordova, since the schools are aging, and we wanted to raise the property and start from scratch, you're really only getting one of those facilities out of this bond, because you wouldn't be able to build more than that. I mean, you would probably be able to use the remaining bond funds for some improvements to the rest of the facilities. But if we were looking for one brand new school facility to replace one of the aging facilities that were built in the 1950s, you're basically talking about one.
Yeah, and also you're not going to qualify for new construction on that. That's going to be modernization money, so you're going to get less money from the state. You're not going to be able to use developer fees for it because it's not creating new capacity. Right. You're just replacing existing capacity. So you're really not going to get very far. And then also the size that you would have to build is, you would realistically, to do that, you would have to build a big enough campus. Because remember, on the Rancho Cordova side, our schools are smaller, 300 kids or so. So you would need the economies of scale, you'd need to build a school of 700 kids, right? And then that means probably you would need to close 2 other schools to make that happen.
And merge them together.
Yeah, right.
How did San Juan Unified, I think it was San Juan, San Juan Unified replace their middle school on Watt Avenue? Because that was a facility, older facility that they tore down and built a brand new middle school.
Arden.
There was a lot of other factors that went into that as well.
No, school's Arden.
Oh, Arden. Yeah.
A lot of other factors that went into that because they had consolidation of schools. They did a big school closing, so they consolidated a lot of schools into different areas. So I think part of that was their consolidation plan. Some of the schools weren't maintained as well, so they were probably having a lot more issues. I don't know the exact issues of everything, but I know a lot of it had to do with the consolidation.
So that's kind of what Sean was just talking about. You would probably have to.
But there's other factors as to why they did that. Our schools are in good condition, and they're maintained very well too.
Right. Well, I think depending on the school, a lot of the considerations you have to take in is the level of things like if you have asbestos and lead in your building, are you going to have to replace out the bones of the campus? Are you going to have to replace out the entire electrical system? At some point, you say it's better to tear down than. And obviously, if you're infilling in an existing community, you would have to look at, because, community schools and the parks right next door are a big part of Rancho Cordova schools. You see that every school you see a park with it, that type of setup. And so if you're wanting to go to a model where you're looking at a larger school, you do have to look at consolidation then potentially.
Okay, thank you.
Also, so in Series D, then we would also have the other $60 million from the other bond that would kick in at that period of time too, correct?
Okay, so you would have the ability in 2033 to potentially access those funds, yes, for sure.
All of them at once, or would it have to be all?
No,
spread
it would
out?
still, we'd have to do a calculation going out that far and looking at what the AV rate was. All of the debt service falls off around that time, but the way the debt service was generated, it's so back-funded on that's why there's no ability to access anything until the entire thing expires.
Okay.
All right, so the other piece you want to consider is there is other outstanding debt if you were going to issue this new debt, right? And that's what this slide is showing you, is that if you combine what is already outstanding with measure NNP, you can see there combined, if we were to pass the top little hatch marked area is the new bond. Combined, all three, even though we're only capping at 60, you have to realize there's other existing debt that you're seeing there. And that's what you're seeing in those other colors there is both measure N and P debt service that the taxpayers would pay. So at the $60, obviously that's the maximum we can do. Now, the other thing I will tell you is that is the maximum we could do with a Prop 39 bond. So there is another method, another type of bond. It's Prop 46. And under a Prop 46 bond, there isn't a cap. We could go higher. A couple of things that come along with that, though. One is that it requires a 2/3 passage rate, right? The other thing is you can't use it for anything furniture or technology related. It's only facilities. So you could go in and you'd have the money to potentially to maybe do more facilities if you wanted to try that bond, right? You could tax at a higher rate, but you would then be limited on what you'd be allowable activities for that, right? There are different components with that as well.
Question.
Yeah.
And this probably goes to the gentleman who spoke earlier from
Charles?
Team Civex.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your bond passage rates, were they Prop 39 or Prop 46 or a combination, or primarily Prop 39?
This one?
Yep.
So virtually all bond measures that go to the ballot these days are Prop 39, just because the passage rate at 55% is such a significant advantage, and the additional flexibility you have for using funds for furnishings, equipment, and technology. I've probably seen less than a dozen Prop 46 bonds in the last decade.
And how'd they do?
They only go to the ballot in very unique circumstances where polling shows that 2/3 is viable, so they tend to have a pretty high passage rate.
Well, the passage rate you list here, I think all are more than 2/3 except for your March 2020.
Correct.
Well, that's statewide.
Yeah,
That's not local passage rate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But locally, Rancho Cordova has been very supportive of the schools and have passed at very high rates. So we could get you that data. I know we had it before on the previous presentation. Okay, so all the past Rancho Cordova bonds have passed by the 2/3 measure,
Yeah.
even though they weren't 2/3 bonds.
Around 70% voter support.
Yeah.
And when we go to the polling to the public and everything like that, could we ask about both as we do it, or?
We certainly can. There's also another strategy that we've used in districts where you're up against, the tax rate thresholds limit the bond proceeds that you can get relative to your needs. The $60 per 100,000 tax rate limit for a Prop 39 bond is per voter authorization. And so, for example, in Modesto City Schools, we didn't put one measure on the ballot, we put two measures on the ballot that doubled their tax rate capacity, so they could do two larger bonds. But they still had the ability to use those proceeds for furnishings, equipment, and technology. So there are different strategies you can utilize to maximize that capacity.
Sure. You could do one for facilities and one for technology and equipment. There's a lot of different options. It's there's a couple other things, though. We do have to look at your overall tax rate within the area of the SFID. We have a total cap on that. And then there's a district-wide cap as well. So that would be something we could work with Joanna on, but we could look at as options as well. That would potentially allow a threshold in excess of that $146 million potentially.
So Sean, if we were to put like 2 initiatives on the ballot, it would be like, let's look at the maximum tax rate of $60. So it would be like 120 with those combined, like 60 for each.
Yeah, or you could do one that's 100 and one that's 60. If you did the 2/3 measure, you can go over the 60.
Right.
It's just a matter of, obviously the more out there, you have to work harder to get everybody to vote yes on all of those things, right? You want to, yeah, I mean, that's where the campaign conversations and the threshold. We can look at all those scenarios, though. We could look at every potential combination.
I mean, have we looked at the what if one passes and one fails? I mean,
we could look at that too, right? We could look. I mean, obviously, a 55 has got a much better chance than a 2/3, right? So maybe 2 55s. I didn't know. I'm sure we could look at that. But again, a big piece would be what is our total taxable level that we can do as a district as well. So, okay. All right. Any questions on this?
Yeah, well, one I might be getting ahead of myself, but all of these figures obviously is factored on the taxable base of the SFID. I mean, the assessed valuation.
Yeah.
But we also do get potential revenue from individuals from out of district that ADA if they come into our district too, right?
Well, we don't. It doesn't come into any facilities pot, but we get if you're talking about like an inter-district transfer, we do get the ADA associated with the student. Yes.
But the ADA can be used for facility.
It can. I mean, that's what we're doing when we do the 3% contribution. That's coming from the general fund ADA, but it's not as though any tax dollars associated with that student their AB would not come into. It's based off of the boundaries of our SFID only.
Right, but any money that we got from the ADA could be put into a broader pot than just simply instructional.
Sure. Well, that's what we do right now. Like we said, we transfer $600,000 from unrestricted general fund, which is ADA money, to the deferred maintenance pot, and then we also do 3% of all of our expenditures, which is unrestricted general fund money, into a maintenance account for our district. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You got it. Other questions? So we talked about kind of looking at the rates, and that's part of the conversation with the survey would be, well, if combined, if you're talking about $260, you're talking about another $60, you're looking at about $300 per $100,000 of assessed value on a residence. So, and it's whether or not that community supports that or not. And what we could also look at is what are the rates for schools in other communities, as for Sac City or some of the other locations near us, Twin Rivers and some of those places, San Juan or whatever the case may be. Right. So what are the facts for SFID 4? Our needs exceed what we have available. We have about $500,000 available at this point. We have access to about $36 million by 2026 in state modernization funds. Now, this assumes that the state will fund those dollars and they will pass a bond. But there's $36 million that would be available at specific school sites, right, that could help with modernizations on those campuses. Passing of a bond at $60 would get us about $146 million over that 4 issuance period. And then we could potentially access additional dollars on Measure N. I'm not sure if the full 60 would be available or not, but I think probably a good chunk of it would be by 2033. We can work on that. And really what it comes down to is a bond in 2024 is really the only option available to continue doing modernization projects for Rancho Cordova schools, existing Rancho Cordova schools. That's really where we are. And so, the takeaway from this conversation is what we're hoping for from the board is direction that this is something we would like to look at scenarios, maybe work on getting the RFP out for Polar, start that process, get some people on board so that we can start the process now for the idea of a 2024 bond. I think realistically, looking at the timelines that we saw earlier, I think we'd be looking at November. And maybe things would line up and we feel aggressive and we could do March. You have time. I think you have up until December to make that decision for March. So we have some time. I mean, obviously we'd be scurrying to get all these things going for you guys, but we can do that for sure. And then bring that forward to the board. So I think where we're at tonight is that I think the facts speak to the need for the Rancho Cordova schools. When we hear concerns about windows and things like that, these are the dollars that make those things happen. These are the dollars that would allow us to do the modernization, do some of the pieces that we would like to do in our community, right, and for our school sites. And so this is the next step for that. So questions or comments or direction from the group, or do you guys want to wait till the end? What can I provide for you on this?
Well, why don't you finish, and before we get to the very last slide, I was, even though it's not a formal board meeting, I would like to invite the public if they have any comments.
Sure.
And then maybe we can.
You want me to do the whole presentation and then come back, or do you want to do each SFID separate?
What's the board's preference here?
I think separate.
Do it separate?
Well,
All right.
it's fresh.
All right, well, then why don't we do it separate? So, before the board perhaps deliberates, or not deliberates, but, pontificates, I don't know what's the best word, but anyway, why don't I invite the public to make any remarks first? Is there anybody from the public that would like to get up and I guess we'll do we keep the 3 minutes?
Good evening, board.
Special session? Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot of information there to take in as a private citizen. I just have to say, in order for this to work, it's got to be some trust. You guys got some work to do. There's a lot of things in our school, on our end of the district, that we've had several bonds to complete. We've done the infrastructure. We need a bond for the exterior, the aesthetics, and we've gotten those. And we haven't gotten quite the bang for the buck. I saw a slide where it said, a grand entrance from the stadium. That's new, but that was a suggestion by myself and some others. A new press box, but it didn't mention anything about ADA stuff that went with it. And the reason I bring that up is because the press box was on the 2002 list of things that we were looking to get in a bond, yet we're 2023 and we're still looking to get what was suggested 20-something years ago. Speed. Seemed like it was going to take a long period of time to get some of the stuff done, maybe next summer or whatnot, when I remember looking and taking pictures of all the schools throughout our district when I was running for office, and I saw quite a few construction companies working on weekends, which makes me believe that that's possible throughout our district. So why we're not doing something like that is beyond me. But those are the things that make me feel like I'm being helped, or I'm being addressed, or my schools are getting taken care of. And I also sat on this bond myself, I came up here to petition for a bond, this last bond, because myself and 3 others, felt like we weren't finished doing what was needed. The school district finished a bond, said we were done, we're out of money, we're done. But we had said there are things that still need to be done, and we got up here and asked to have this study done so that we could get a Measure P. So I'm scared to think that if we hadn't done that, where we might be right now, because that was a significant bond. And so I just had to say those things because they were on my chest. And moving forward, I will be as helpful and watchful as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else from the public? Yeah.
This doesn't really go to the board, but I would like to know when the survey goes ahead and get, Jeanette Sanzabach, FCA, you know who I am. When the surveys get done for this particular, who does the survey actually go to? Does it go to the homeowners that owns the house or the buildings, or does it go to the renters that are in the house? So I'm curious of who actually gets the surveys, and that may be a different outcome of those surveys. Just because of the fact of who are in those housing in the apartments and all of those other things. So just something I thought I would ask.
Thank you.
Do we have an answer for that?
It's the taxpayers that live within that SFID that will vote.
So the voters.
So it would be so if the homeowner lives within the SFID, they would vote on it. But, it's whoever is a registered voter. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, so because we're trying to estimate support in an election, the registered voter pool is the relevant population we're trying to survey. And so that's going to include a mix of homeowners and renters, just like the registered voter pool includes. And we make sure that those groups, homeowners versus renters, are represented proportionally within the sample to the same extent that they exist in the registered voter population. So it's all the demographics of the sample for the survey mirrors the demographics of the electorate.
Welcome.
So I do have a follow-up question to that. Being that it's a survey, it's very common that you can't do, the area has 1 million people and you can't do a survey for all 1 million people. So is it really just more of a segmented, like only a couple hundred in an area able to get that survey? Or is it a little bit more expansive to where people, not just a small amount, but a decent amount, actually get to be able to express their opinion on what they think of it, if it's good, if it's not, how much the amount should be, what the rate is? That's one of my questions. The other thing is the more I've been getting more involved, just from a citizen standpoint of kind of seeing new development and new schools and everything that's going out there, and I'm all for it, is you see a lot of new development. It just happens to be in Folsom, but I see a lot of schools that are a lot older in Rancho. And with what I'm seeing is, how do you determine how are those schools also going to get the benefit? And is it just one side getting more than the other? Is it fairness? It's just hard to tell what's really being done. And as someone that pays taxes and property and stuff, I don't know. It just seems like one side is not really getting a lot out of it from what I can see. So that's just all I had to say.
Thank you. And I'll just remind the public that any comments or questions are taken as comments because we don't interact. All right. Any other? Yeah.
Just for the record, did we get his name? I mean, I don't think we.
Oh, sorry, Brian.
Okay.
Strang.
Okay.
All right.
Would you like me to respond to the board on those questions or no?
Yeah, if you want to respond.
Okay. Since we're here, I'll have Charles answer the question about how a survey works. Go ahead, Charles.
Sure. So survey for a community of this size, actually for each SFID, if you're able to get 400 to 600 completed interviews, the statistics, as long as that sample is random and it represents the demographics of the community, the statistics say that the results should be within plus or minus 5% of the same results as you would receive if you talk to every single registered voter in the community. So it is representative. Yeah. But it's a relatively small pool of people you're talking to, but the representativeness is what counts.
And then with regards to the question about fairness and making sure everybody gets their money, that's what the SFIDs are there for, right? SFID 4 is only for Rancho Cordova. Only the community within Rancho Cordova will vote on that bond, and only those people will be taxed on that. And then the dollars will only go towards those school sites. It's not as though those dollars can be used by SFID 5 or SFID 3. Same with SFID 5, if they pass a bond, it can only be for those school sites. So there might be questions about priorities with those dollars and how those dollars were used, but those dollars were all used only for Rancho Cordova. And so there are times where, that's right, there will always be a list. When we went back and looked at the list, there will always be a list, and the list will always never get completely done. That will always happen. But that's what you are wanting to do as a board. That's where community input comes in, that prioritizes those lists. But then when we do those lists, some examples are when we modernize the campus, we want to prioritize that and we want to do beautification. But the truth is when we walk in there, the first thing we have to do is life safety. We have to do ADA access, which often can be 2/3 to 3/4 of the project, right? And so dollars that we would hope to be able to get down to maybe number 4 or 5 on the project list don't always happen there. So that's also important to realize when we're doing that. This money is tiered specifically for Rancho Cordova. It will only be used for Rancho Cordova. And then also, not only will you have a voice when it comes to a survey, but you will also have a voice during the input cycle when we communicate out to our families about we're looking at a bond, come to these sessions and speak to what are your priorities. Then you will also have a voice when you get the vote on it, right? That's the whole purpose of it, is your community is voting on whether you want to tax yourself to support the schools with this list of projects, right? But we also have to be realistic on how far along $146 million gets on those. And so do we prioritize sports facilities over a classroom setting or vice versa, or can we make both work? We have to look at all of those things, right? And that's what we have to do. That's what the board does. That's what staff make recommendations for, all of those pieces. So hopefully that clarifies some of that.
So is staff looking for kind of general direction at this point on?
I would say after we complete Okay. on all 3 SFIDs, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't want the board to comment on each SFID separate?
We can do one at a time if you'd like. I mean, I'm fine with whatever you feel is appropriate.
What does the board prefer? You want to do one SFID at a time for your comments?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I mean, because they all would be different bond measures, right?
Correct.
So, all right, why don't we finish SFID 4 then first? Thoughts from the board?
Mr. President?
Yes, Board Member Hui.
It definitely, we have to do something, it sounds like. So I'm in favor of having this feasibility study to see if it makes sense, if the public's willing to support this. But I do just want to, I guess, make a comment based on the public comment as well as Mr. Martin's comments. I mean, I understand these dollars go to SFID 4 only, but as long as we're only basing what the bond can be on the assessed value of the property, I mean, this is the kind of inequity at its finest, right? Folsom is always going to have, as long as those assessed values remain higher, they're going to have more money for their properties, enabling us at Folsom to build more property or do more with that money. So we need to do something about this SFID, but I do want to kind of at least talk about, or maybe I believe Charles could comment on this, to talk about, does it make any sense for us to look at a district-wide bond where the entire district is voting on the bond, and then we have access to that money to use it wherever we want to. If it makes more sense to use it in Rancho Cordova, we can put it there. If it makes more sense to use it in Folsom at the time, we could put it there. I'm just worried that, if we keep doing things this way, Cordova is going to have half as much of a bond as Folsom, and we can't do that much with that money. So, I guess, Mr. Martin or Charles, if you guys could comment on, while we're doing this feasibility study on the separate SFIDs, is there any value to doing one, interviewing people about the district as a whole, and if that's something that voters would be behind?
Yeah, so Tim, I can speak to a little bit of a historical perspective on that. So that is what happened prior to the creation of the SFIDs, and then the bonds did not pass, right? And that was part of the reason why the discussion of splitting the district really occurred in the 90s, was because on the Folsom side of the community, they were worried that they had new schools that they had to build, and they didn't have dollars. And on the Rancho Cordova side, which was the majority of the population at the time, they're about 2/3 of the student population, they felt like their dollars would then go towards subsidizing Folsom schools. And that's why those things did not pass at the time. And that's why Folsom at the time wanted to split. So what you're saying in a perfect world would be great. We all support each other. They're all our kids, right? But the truth is, and we could definitely survey that if you wanted to include that. We could have Charles work on that, looking if we wanted to go forward with him on a survey. But the reality of it is that normally the community wants ownership of those dollars to ensure that they're going towards their students and their schools. And so I think what you would see is probably similar to what happened in the back in the 90s. And best case scenario, yes, every student, regardless of boundaries, is going to be part of this community, right? And as a whole, and they may live in Rancho but work in Folsom or whatever the case may be. But normally, as a taxpayer, if I know my dollars are not going to impact me directly or my community directly, they're less likely to support. That would be what historically what has happened in Folsom, Cordova. Right. And also, I don't know how thrilled Matt would be as if we added a 6th SFID, but we could definitely do it. I think we're getting close to the state lead on number of SFIDs. So, Charles, I don't know if anything you would want to add to that?
Well, I think the fact that your last several bond measures have been on an SFID basis, voters are now used to the idea that their tax dollars are guaranteed to stay within their community. So I think that complicates a district-wide proposal. You know, most school districts don't have SFIDs. It's kind of a unique outgrowth in some districts where you have distinct communities within your boundaries. So I think I agree it's politically challenging, something we could look at in polling, but I think we would want to compare the district-wide option against the SFID option since that's proven successful here.
I would also think that as long as the district is talking about splitting, it probably wouldn't be advantageous to consider a district-wide bond either.
Definitely would add another layer to things, yes. But yeah, because with regards to the potential reorganization, SFID 4 and 5 would actually still work fine. They would still cover the community that potentially a reorganization would impact. So that is true, would lessen that component. So, okay. So other questions on SFID 4 or discussion?
You know, I mean, facilities are like my favorite topic. So honestly, I don't really see a future forward for Rancho Cordova schools unless we start really looking at this. We're talking about inequities and things like that. And it's hard to compare inequity because you're talking about a brand new school that in an area that needed a brand new school, right? And it's just our ed specs are different back from 1960 and 1970 than they are now, right? So those collaborative spaces, I think what's hard is when you're in a Rancho Cordova school and you're hearing about these amazing collaborative spaces and this and that, and you're like, we feel, those parents, those students feel very far removed from what that looks like for them, And so, I feel like if we don't kind of like act now, we're just going to be kicking the can down the road of being able to like kind of deal with these inequities, And it's like we want to be able to, have these for our EL students and our SPED students and things like that, to have these spaces where they can thrive. And, I think that when we're looking at it, when we're looking at the prioritization of things, just really getting that input, and I think one thing we haven't really talked about too much is our teacher input as well when we're talking about the sites, because they're the ones who are kind of working in that environment as well. So, I think collaborating with them and their priorities and things like that, also to make comfortable spaces for them, because I know like the bathroom conversation at Cordova High was specifically driven with conversation with the teacher, of lack there. So I think just making sure that as we start, getting to that point and prioritizing that list, that we're really digging into like exactly what it is that community needs. So, I mean, my thought is that we're going to probably need more than the one. I mean, as much as I would love to say $146 million is going to cover it, I mean, just based off of builds that we've had, it's not going to be enough. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. But, I would love to just see the options of what we have available, and then, we can kind of go from that point.
Okay.
I'm always in for a good feasibility study. So, I mean, I think it's a good idea. And as long as it's staying in that area 4, and I know the modernizations that need to be done there, I'm all for it. I do have a difference of opinion on when you were talking about maybe doing 2 measures on the ballot. I mean, I can always see one passing and I can always see one failing, and what do we do with that? I mean, so, yeah, I mean, I would be all for it. I'm going to ask the question of the cost of this study. What's it going to cost the district to have this done? But albeit, I would love to see what we have out there and what we can possibly pull. I do agree with my colleague that 146 isn't enough, but I'm also concerned about a few other factors, such as our renters property owners may be absorbing that extra tax. It just depends on how we sell this thing. So I say go for it. I would also like to get input from board member, oh God, forgive me, Lofthouse, on her thoughts, but unfortunately she's not here. I don't know if we're getting a consensus tonight on that, but
I think for us, where we're looking at is that we'll start the RFP process. We'll start looking to bring in a bond advisor or a campaign advisor / a polling. Probably bring that here shortly, and then we have an October meeting to follow up in that. But what we would probably be looking at is starting the process for looking at going out for potentially a bond, if that's the direction the board. Now, the
are you
details
looking for
of
that direction tonight?
Well, I think what I'm looking for is that you want us to continue forward the process, right? Because if we're not interested, if the board's not interested in that, then yeah, we wouldn't go any further. If you're interested, then there's a lot of steps that we need to start taking right now.
I would say okay. I mean, I just think that maybe we need to have a little more dialogue.
There'll be nothing but dialogue once we start going out for a bond.
But maybe
it will be every meeting I will come up and talk to you about something.
Then we'll be running until about 10:30, 11 o'clock. I'm used to making that motion to extend it anyway. I don't know. Is it possible to put it on an agenda to have a little more dialogue about it? But I mean, there's still, 4 other SFIDs that we need to dive into. But honestly, number 4 is important to me. So I'm all for it.
Yeah, as for me, just to put this in perspective for folks, we have, out of our 36 facilities, 20 of them were built prior to 1990. And of the 20 that were built prior to 1990, and I'm not counting Folsom High because that was rebuilt as a new facility at the turn of the century, the 21st century. Only 5 of them are in the city of Folsom. 15 are in the city of Rancho Cordova, just to put it in perspective. So although interestingly, the oldest facility we have was built in 1950, which was Theodore Judah Elementary School, which is in Folsom. But once you get past that, and by the way, a happy birthday to Theodore Judah. They're 73 years old. Mather Heights is 72 years old. Rancho Cordova Elementary is 67 years old. Mills Mitchell is 66 years old. Cordova Gardens is 64 years old. Cordova Lane is 51 years old, although we're not using it for, well, we are, I guess, for TK. Kitty Hawk Elementary School, which is where the Kitty Hawk campus, where our charter school is. Actually, I don't have a date for that. I'm not sure how old that is. It looks old, though. White Rock Elementary School is 63 years old. Cordova High is 62 years old. Peter J. Shields is 62 years old. Williamson is 61 years old. Mitchell Middle is 59. Riverview is 46. Then you start getting to some of the Folsom. You got Blanche Sprents, which is 58. Cordova Meadows is 58. Cordova Villa is 57. Folsom Middle is 55. Kinney High is 52. And Carl Sundell is 36 and Oak Chan's 34. So that's all the schools that were built prior to 1990. So, obviously we have an aging infrastructure and we do have a disparity. I know we've renovated the schools. I know many of the schools are wonderful facilities, but you can only cover certain, paint so many times. And the community in Rancho Cordova really is demanding for facilities that are at par with those that we're building in Folsom. So, I guess I'm very supportive of doing a bond measure to do something in SFID 4. And what I would challenge staff is to think big and don't roll anything out automatically out. Don't, make certain assumptions. Well, of course they won't do that, or that's too bold of an initiative or something along those lines. I think bold is what we need or what we want, or at least to consider. And so maybe when you come back, with the bold option, the mediocre option, and then just the, this basic option. But, really, reimagine. I mean, when you look at, and again, this may be controversial, but I'm going to throw it out there because that's what the purpose of tonight's meeting is. You were talking about you might have to consolidate in order to build a new facility. Well, that should be on the table then. You look at some of the elementary schools in Folsom, whether it's Mangini Ranch, Russell Ranch, Sandra Gigliotti is back up there again because of the overflow from south of 50. But all of them are over 600 students. And yet we have some elementary schools in Rancho Cordova that are 250 students and 300 students and 280 students, basically half the size of some of the elementary schools in Folsom. So if you were to say, as a bold, option, is you take two elementary schools and you combine them with a brand new facility, then I think that's something to at least propose as one of the options for the board to consider. Rather, because I don't know. I mean, I don't live in Rancho Cordova, but I hear the residents of Rancho Cordova all the time, and it's consistent. They want something new, comparable, at par with their with the residents in Folsom, and they deserve that. I mean, I've said this in the past. Do we expect, to celebrate 100 years at a certain school facility in Rancho Cordova that, happy birthday, our school is 100 years old? We celebrated a 100-year anniversary of Folsom High, but it wasn't at the same physical building. They built a brand new campus. So anyway, that's my thoughts, and I wouldn't necessarily rule out a prop. What was that 49? I think you said
46.
46. Prop 46. I wouldn't automatically rule that out. It might not make sense, and that could be the ultimate advice to the board. It doesn't make sense. Maybe Prop 39 makes more sense. But I just would encourage staff as you move forward is to think outside the box, be bold, come back with options at varying levels. I will say when I look at slide 20 on the needed capital projects, there are some major projects here that I 100% agree. The new library for Cordova High School, new administrative building for Cordova High School. When you look at, I hate to say this, but when you look at Cordova High School's library and administrative building, and then look at the library and administrative building at Folsom High and Vista del Lago, you could probably put 3 or 4 of those Cordova High libraries in Folsom and Vista's libraries. You could probably put 5 or 6 of the administrative buildings in Folsom and Vista's administrative buildings. So, I think this is the time for us to take a serious look at this issue.
Yep, for sure.
I would just like to say, I agree completely with what you're saying as far as options, and I think it lends itself then to the further conversation that Mr. Clark is looking for, as far as giving us all the options so that we can really dig into what direction we need to go. And, hopefully by the time we have that, we can get a few more community members that are in here to help us drive that conversation with the direction. But yeah, I agree that we obviously need more conversation about it, but I kind of want to be able to see all the options on the table, like throw everything against the wall kind of a situation so that we can decide what's the best course forward.
Right. So. And when we talk about the big idea options, obviously we have to use a lot of assumptions to know, we can say, a school costs $100 million, but, without design and build out and what we would need to do, there are certain things that, so, it'll be very, very,
high level.
Loose, yeah, loose is on the numbers for sure. So I just want to make sure, but yeah, we can definitely we can sit down and spitball a lot of different things. So, and again, the community that will be paying for it is Rancho Cordova. So if that's what the community's voice is, we can do that. right? We can make those things happen.
And presumably, at least hypothetically, if you were combining two into a nice new shiny big facility, surplus property we could sell as well.
Well, again, that's a school. That's where there's
Oh, it would
playgrounds
go
and
to
everything
the bond.
else.
It would go
Yeah.
to the-
Well, it doesn't go to the bond. It actually, we are required to offer it to other government entities first. There's a whole process, and
But
I'm
they have to
forgetting-
pay market value.
No, they don't pay market value. They pay our value plus a increase in, there's like a inflation increase or something like that. Yeah. So it's not like we would see the current value given to us for that land, right? So it's something, but it's part of the process. We'll talk through that with you as well. That's what the October meeting's about, is diving into more of those specific details on those things.
Okay.
And obviously, between now and then, we'll be working on a lot of pieces as well. So, but it sounds like I'm getting direction from the board that we definitely can go ahead and move forward at looking for going forward on a bond, looking at sizing, number of them, scope, get the RFP going so that we can look at getting folks on board so they can help us with the survey, all of those pieces. Is that direction from the board at this point? Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. And then as soon as we have, a vendor selected, be it Charles or whatever group that we finalize with, we'll bring that contract forward. So you'll have the price on that, Chris, and we can go forward from there. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Awesome.
All right, let's move on to SFID 5.
Okay, so you're going to see a lot of similar slides, just different numbers. Folsom, similar idea in the fact that this first slide just shows you the existing area. It's north of 50, more or less following the river up is the Folsom boundary. We have one bond that was passed. There is still dollars available on that bond. You can see there's about $6 million after all of the projects associated with that. And then you see the $6 million that's left is planned to be done for projects at Empire Oaks, Centro de Gallardo. And because, again, timing-wise, they're within that 25-year window, they're right in that window for modernization projects. You can see, again, a lot of these are duplicated. We have needs across the district to some of our backbone pieces, some of the technology, those pieces, safety. But there are specific areas that we have identified as well. So if we were to go out for $60 there, you can see instead of, what was it, 140 something million, you're looking at 300 million. Because again, the assessed value for the community is larger, right? And that's based off of property values within the community, and the area. And you can see, so at $60, you're looking at about 300 million, a little over 300 million over 4 issuances that Folsom could receive. If you overlap it with the existing bond, remember only one bond was passed, you see the tax rate. You'll see also that the tax rate is lower than Rancho because, again, because the assessed value is higher, it spreads out over more. And so that's why the tax rate is lower for that group, because the last bond was less cost than NNP were over for Rancho Cordova. So combined, you'd be looking at 146 for Folsom Cordova if you were to do that for them. So same kind of situation here. Where are the facts? Folsom has about $32 million in state modernization funding between now and 2026. You could generate as much as $332 million if we did the $60 tax rate. Passage of the bond here is a little more flexible in the time because of having about $5 million or $6 million left potentially available. It's not as concerning to wait till 2026. I think, bless you. Ideally, I think what we would say is for design-wise, if we went out in 2024, it would help the process because we would know those other dollars are there when we would run low. But at the same time, I think we have to realize that there are dollars available. There is a little more flexibility, and trying to pass multiple bonds for both sides of the community. I might have Charles speak to that. One of the things I spoke to initially and asked Charles about is the amount of time and effort. I've participated in several bonds. It is very time consuming to pass a bond when we talk about the phone calls and the meetings and all of the bond campaigning. And so having 2 campaigns at once will definitely stretch resources thin. I wouldn't say with this group and this team that we couldn't do it. I'm just saying that ideally, if you can time it so that we're tiering those bonds. I think that's probably the best use of resources, so we're not going to burn both ends of the candle to get these through. But I'll leave that to the board if that's something that you would want to look at or not. And then I think, if you have questions for Charles about running duplicate bonds for two sides of the community or not, that's a question as well. So.
Sean, wouldn't you say that SFID 5 is perhaps the one that could wait the longest before we go back out to the voters, seeing that Measure G was the last major, Measure G was adopted, 2014?
Is that right?
2014?
2014,
yeah. And we still have some funds on that. The renovations that took place with Measure G were phenomenal. And you did a great job spreading those funds around to all of the Folsom schools. But I guess I'd be hard pressed to answer the question, what immediately do we need that is so dire that we need to try to get a bond done in SFID 5 right now? Maybe there is. Is there something that
I wouldn't say, go ahead. You guys want to speak to something?
So I think the challenge from the design perspective is, it's not working. Sorry. Is we're coming up on the modernization of Folsom High School. And so the funds that we have available to do over 200,000 square feet is less, right? And so the difference between knowing that there's additional dollars out there means you do decision-making differently, right? You may do one building really well and wait for additional money to do another building really well versus we're just gonna do carpet everywhere. So there are different design decisions that go into how much money you have the day that you're making the decisions. And so I think that that's why you have to look at where that bond happens. And I don't know, maybe 2026, just knowing that there's a commitment to go out to bond is enough, that you make decisions differently than saying we may never get any money ever again, right? Those are two different decision-making philosophies. So.
Matt, we hit Folsom High in 2025, is that right? 25 years?
There's actually two phases of Folsom High, so that has a little complexity. The first phase of Folsom High is eligible now for starting construction next year, and then we'll be planning for phase 2. We can't start that until it's eligible. So that's part of what Terry is speaking to is knowing if you're going to have more money, you plan differently, or the possibility when you're going for your next planning project. So Folsom High is a lot different because we're doing phase 1. We're trying to do projects that can be isolated. So if we have more money, we don't redo what we did.
Yeah.
Having phase 2, planning on that, if we had another bond, we would size that, we would plan it differently. So that's the kind of the limbo area that we're talking about. If we're not going to go out for a bond, then we would probably scale that differently. And then in the future, if we did a bond, then we would plan for that at that point.
At the very least, with the different SFIDs, would it be easier or more difficult for the district to focus on one SFID at a time, focus our energies rather than having to spread it out over multiple election cycles?
Well, like Sean was saying, it's obviously it would be easier to focus on one than two, but we've done two before. Sean said we're up to the task, whatever needs to be done. But knowing it, we just have to look at it differently.
So what would you need for Folsom High renovations if that's coming up to for the 25-year mark?
Well, it's the interior of the buildings. You have floors, walls, ceilings. You don't go in and you just do the floors because then you wouldn't later and then come in and do the ceilings. You would want to do it all at one time, economies of scale. So you just take one building and do one thing. We're trying to concentrate on, okay, we're going to do heating and air conditioning system. Doesn't matter if that's, have another bond, you can do that in isolation. We have certain upgrades we need to do. Do you do some restrooms now? Do you do the restrooms later? You have landscaping improvements you need to do. Do you hold off on some of those? Do you can concentrate on some other facilities? You prioritize differently based on the amount of dollars you have available. If you have another bond, then you're going to plan your project differently. Your economies of scale become different. you have a larger project, you do it all at one time rather than trying to do smaller projects and determine where your priorities are.
Do you have an estimate of the amount of costs a Folsom High renovation would take?
Well, to
Yes.
do everything we'd want to do, if we were to pass a new bond, we would go back in and reprioritize and look at some of the issues. But I mean, I could easily see spending 60, 70 million. I mean, look at Cordova High, we spent over $70 million. Sutter, we spent over $50 million. Similar type of thing, as these age, there's more things that need to be done, so.
And wouldn't that be part of the purpose of getting a new facility master plan? That would help in that.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely would help. We can pretty much identify some potential costs just based on some of the needs we have, within that school. Cost per square foot factors, we can do some estimates. It's a large campus, too.
Would a facility master plan be completed before you come back to the board and ask for authorization to go forward with a bond?
It might not have every detail of what the costs are to that level, but I think it would identify the needs and some estimates based on what the needs are within those areas, some facility assessments.
Would it be possible to do facility master plans based on the SFID? So would it be possible, hypothetically, before October to get a facility master plan for SFID 4, not the entire district?
October of this year?
By October?
Yeah.
Not by October.
Not by October, okay.
No.
All right.
The level of analysis is pretty deep on that.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, though, is with SFID 5, if we are planning for a 2026 bond, we can build the project out. That's right. There is some economies of scale that we may not get to, but projects will continue. On SFID 4, projects can't continue.
Right.
And so that is, in my mind, a higher priority within that scope.
Right.
And to, I think once we dive into and we talk about the scope of what a bond campaign really means, especially if potentially we go out for 2 bonds in Rancho Cordova, I think the ability for us to do it and do it well would require us to concentrate on one or the other and not both.
Yeah.
I would worry about not being able to continue projects on the Rancho Cordova side to incorporate projects on the Folsom side that yes, would potentially be more efficient, but ultimately could continue to some degree. And that would be the concern. And I think when we have a bond campaign advisor and we talk about the scope, when you actually see the checklist of all of the steps and processes for doing a bond, when it comes to the board and it comes to staff and it comes to the community, the ask is huge. And it's a big lift. And so it will take everybody on board to do that. And we definitely have. I mean, the district has done one time in the past, but it's not something that I think, when we get there, we can discuss it in more detail, I think.
Yeah, actually, you articulated it better than I ever could. I don't want to accidentally sacrifice Rancho Cordova because we're trying to squeeze in Folsom. I think the ultimate priority right now is SFID 4. Not to say SFID 5 isn't a priority. It's just not the same level of priority as SFID 4.
There's still funding there that allows them to continue forward for at least a period of time.
I'm also a little bit concerned if we are taking 2 to the public and we have one at 147 million and another one at 300, that we're going to also be dealing with some issues between the community of Rancho saying like, well, why can't we access, and then you've got to have a very difficult, long conversation with them about the different valuation processes. That's going to be possibly confusing, because it's not something you can just, if you're going to a door, you're not going to be able to just deliver that quickly. That's a pretty detailed conversation. So we may end up shooting ourselves in the foot on SFID 4 if we try to do both at the same time.
Yeah, I think we just need to stop what we're doing right now and focus on 4 and not dive. I mean, all these other ones are important, but we know where our priorities are right now. And I think it's SFID 4. We just need to come together as a community, as a board, as a staff, not try to double up on a bond in Folsom and a bond in Rancho, but just focus on that one bond in Rancho Cordova in Area 4. I mean, I know number 5, Area 5 is important. I don't know, maybe we do look at it in 2026, but right now, I mean, why are we trying to push everything? You guys are going to be spread thin. I mean, think about it, the upcoming year, I mean, with Don and you with the budget and everything else, that's going to be too much. I'm going to be totally real. I think it's going to be too much on you guys. So, number 4 is not as a heavy lift. I think we can do it as a team, as a community. Why don't we just focus on that?
Okay. All right. I have some direction on that then?
Not to say that bring it back in a couple of years. But
Okay.
Yeah.
No.
No.
Okay.
That
All right.
leaves us, oh, actually, hold on. I forgot to ask, is there anybody in the public who wanted to speak on SFID 5?
Can I ask a quick question? I don't know who I would ask.
Do you want to come to the podium, Jeanette?
Do you want to use the mic?
When you do the AF or AV,
EV.
right? How do you determine that? Is that what the house is currently assessed at? Like what I pay my taxes on? Or is it what I could get it if I sold my house? Or does the new owner get that new AV? None of the above? Okay, I'm just curious. I'm not here as a resident now.
Would you like me to
Yeah,
answer that?
please.
So assessed value is based off of the tax rate. So what you're getting taxed at is the assessed value that is calculated. So when your home sells and someone else buys it, that gets a new assessed value. And a lot of times that's when we see a big pop there. And so, Joanna, would you like to add a little more to that? Go ahead. This is your first chance to talk. Go ahead. Don't be shy. You're good. Go for it.
Your assessed value is determined every year. It starts in the beginning of the year when the assessors in Sacramento County go out and they go all around and they determine what your assessed values are going to be. Right? And then they have a number. They have a number for everybody's house. And then they adjust that number by words like unity, you have secured taxes, you have unsecured property. So it's not formulaic, but the words are always the same. So every year they come up with a number, which they say is going to be the assessed value of your house. Now, if you sell your house, that makes it easy for them, right? There's the price. But other than that, they only by law, by Prop 13, it's only 1% increase every year. So that's the increase. It's always 1 or 2%. If you look at your tax bills, you should be able to calculate that. But then as far as your tax rate goes, there are other adjustments to it for all the things that go into what you pay for in your taxes. Is that okay?
Yep. Okay.
And I guess any other members of the public on SFID 5?
Does it have to be on 5? Or I just have one quick question because I don't have understanding of why something is the way it is.
Well, you can direct the question to the board.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I know there's SFID 3, which if I looked at it right, it's part of Rancho Cordova, and then there's 4. Am I mistaken? Why is it, especially with 3, there's a lot of the development and a lot of growth has happened there. Why is it really separated? It's really a huge part of Rancho. I don't understand if, I don't know, me as a citizen, I live in that section, and if it's part of Rancho, why can't we help 4 if 4 needs it? I'm confused on why that is, if that makes sense.
And actually, this is perfect transition.
Sorry,
because we
don't understand.
No. Actually, it was a perfect transition because we are now have to cover SFID number 3 as part of the presentation. So maybe you could build into your presentation an explanation.
Sure. So the way SFID 3 was generated was it was an area that was being a new development area. And so it was separated from SFID 4 and 5. So SFID 3, when it was created, really there was only one development within SFID 3, which was North Douglas. The North Douglas community was the only one that was in SFID 3. The developers at that time were saying there was going to be this huge build out, and we don't really have all of the map, but in essence, there are going to be 4 major subdivisions that will be built out along the Highway 50 corridor. Starting kind of west to east, there is Rio del Oro, which is the newest subdivision. We're seeing part of it done by Elliott. And then continuing along there, there is Westboro, Glenboro, Easton, and then Folsom Ranch. And so those are all each a development area that will all be encompassed in SFID. At the time, the reason why it was separated was there was nothing built out. And so what they wanted to do was go for a bond in that entire area because they knew in totality, there was supposed to be a total of number of 20-something schools. And so they, at the time, when the price of schools in the early 2000s, they thought for the $750 million plus the developer fees that would come in, plus the state money, that would pay for all the schools. And that was because the developers were saying all these houses are going to be built within the next 20 years. And of course, none of those houses got built within the first 10 years. And so now, of course, that $750 million won't allow us to build all those schools. But reason why we separated it out was because that area, we did not want the existing communities of Folsom and Rancho Cordova to have to pay for the new schools that would have to be built. So that was so now you're talking about the reverse situation where you'd like to be able to support SFID 4, but at the time the idea is SFID 4 and 5 are not going to want to have to pay for those schools being built. So it was, again, separating the tax rates out between the different communities. Does that make sense for everybody? That's as clear as mud that I can explain it, but hopefully everybody understood. So that was SFID 3. And again, now we're starting to see development. Now, we obviously, Folsom Ranch has the most significant development. That's why we're seeing new schools being built out there. Eventually, when everything is said and done, the area that encompasses or has influence from Rancho Cordova will actually end up having more homes and schools than the Folsom side. But right now, Folsom is being built out first. And so that's why you're seeing the development and the growth there. On the Rancho side, really the only development is Rio del Oro, and a very small portion of it that is Elliott Homes. The remaining portion of Rio del Oro is part of the Aerojet complex, which is all the other subdivisions, which actually were the first areas that actually had the first plan design developed was the Rancho Cordova. So in fact, when the bond was originally passed, the first school that actually was being designed, we're going to talk about it in a minute, was the new middle school, high school, believe it or not. And so the very first money that got put out was for that school. But of course, that got shelved because nothing ever got built out over there. And it sat and sat and sat. And so everything shifted over to Folsom. So if things had happened the way they had, we'd probably already have however many new schools and tens of thousands of more kids, right? If we had built it based off of the development information we got, from the developers. But obviously we had 07, 08 and everything that happened, stock market and, all those Lehman Brothers and all that good stuff, right? So anyway, SFID number 3, and this is the big boy, right? So this is actually the majority, believe it or not, this is 55% of the district's boundaries is in this more or less area. Which includes Folsom Ranch, which again is the most developed area at this point. That's Mangini Ranch, Otter Creek coming from that area, and then going around. You can see that the assessed value for that has significantly increased. So another thing that happened is when we initially issued bonds, we had a situation where we made assumptions that the assessed value was going to grow because all these houses were going to be built. Developers were giving these wonderful numbers of all these houses. And of course, they didn't know, we didn't know that the market was going to drop and nothing happened for years. But the tax payments still needed to be made on those bonds. And so what happened is our tax rate, you can see there, jumped up, and you see that we jumped up to about $388 was 21-22, which we hope will never be seen again. That's the peak, but that is the reality of what happened there. And then it's dropping down from there. So that's SFID 3 in a kind of a nutshell. So this is probably the slide everybody really wants to see is a couple of things. So this is what we have for build out of all of the schools related to SFID 3. And what you see is in green are Folsom schools, blue are Rancho schools, and you see one black, which is a district support building that we have built into our plans. And you see what we're looking at is right now in 2024, we're looking at an Alder Creek finish. And between 2026 and 2029, we have, based off of enrollment, we would have a third elementary in Folsom, the high school, phase 1 in Folsom, and then Rio del Oro, which would be the first Rancho Cordova school, which would be over there where the Elliott Holmes area is. Now, a couple of things to note of that. The 2024 state bond would need to pass realistically for us to be able to afford the Rio del Oro project, because we need the state matching money that we would get for Alder Creek. Does that make sense? So Alder Creek, the project we're doing for Alder Creek, we're upfronting the entire project using developer fees, bond money, and we would hopefully get state money. Well, we'll have to upfront the project because the state takes 3 years at a minimum to get the money back to us. Once we get that state money, we can then put it back into Measure M and use it for these other projects. So we're dependent upon the assumption for Rio del Oro being done is dependent upon the state bond passing, so we have enough money to do that project. But you see right around that time is when Measure M is depleted. These $750 million associated with Measure M, along with the developer fees collected for those projects, along with state money, would put us in a place where we would pretty much be out of funds. Now, potentially with the high school and the elementary and Rio del Oro, we would have some state funds that would push it out, but Measure M would be done. We'd get state money, maybe would allow us to do another project or two. But that is obviously not what the plans were when the $750 million bond was created in the 2000s. And so in 20 years, a lot has changed in cost of schools. And so that is kind of where we are. So I think one of the questions is how Measure M will impact the entire community. Now, Measure M is a bond that covers the entire SFID 3. So, but right now at this point, the tax rate that is being charged are only for those people that are living there, which is obviously the majority of them are on the Folsom side. We have a little bit at Rio del Oro, just opened up really, and then we have the one subdivision that has been paying from day one is North Douglas. They've been in that area since day one, and so that's kind of where we are as a district now. With regards to the fact that that $750 million will be completed, when we do the last issuance, because we probably have 2 issuances left within the $750 million that we will need to do to complete those projects, that will then impact the tax rate, obviously. We have to look at the timing on that. We're still working out all the specific details of that timing with a lot of assumptions on cost of design and all of those things, cost of property, everything else. And so where we are, is looking at a situation where when the last bond issuance hits, which may be 28, somewhere in that ballpark range, 29 maybe, I don't know, when that hits, that bond is then going to be a payout for 30 years, right? And so I think one of the questions or concerns is that community, that large overall community, will all pay towards that 30-year bond, even though the schools that were generated are primarily in one side of the district. But that is the reality of when you have build out that's not consistent throughout the area that the SFID is built out in. That's just the reality of it, right? And so the question comes into a couple things. One, when we get close to Measure M being depleted, we're going to need to be talking about in probably 2028, going out for another bond for SFID 3, right? And that's going to be a conversation about what is the tax rate associated with it, how are those dollars going to be distributed, do people feel, again, this is similar to what happened years ago in Folsom, and what Tim was asking about is, do the community feel like the dollars are being equitably distributed if I'm paying tax for 30 years and I don't see those facilities or not? And that's where if you all feel like we're all together, we're all one district, and we're supporting each other, and this is how it works, even though it's not in my community, it's still something that I support, or does it become fractured like we have had to do with SFID 4 and 5 in the future? It's hard to say. So it's just things you have to consider, right? I'm just putting all of these things forward to you as a board on, we have to keep that in mind when we get to the point where we deplete those dollars. So obviously the biggest single cost is the high school, right? And we're working on those. We've had meetings with the BIA and developers. We've had some very good meetings of showing cost comparisons of what West Park has cost and some other things. And we will continue those conversations with them. We're going to share those conversations with the board. I think October will be a place where we'll dive into that a little bit more. I think this conversation will have to dive deeper, especially since we only have 15 minutes for our evening this evening. But what are the things I think we want to talk about? We had originally said it was from 6 to 9, so I don't know if you guys want to go later or not, but presentation-wise, we can go as long as the board likes. I can speak all night. But I think what the big question here is looking at this timeline, you see that only one school on the Rancho Cordova side gets built out. And so maybe if we get state funds, right, and other components. But that's also built off the idea that it's where the students are, right, to a certain degree, right, and access for all students available, right. And so one of the things we also have to keep in mind is you have students that are in SFID 3, right, but the Rio del Oro, and they don't have a school unless they go over to Mangini or Alder Creek, right, that are within the SFID, right. The closest school to them is Navigator. So that's something we have to keep in mind as well. So this is something the board has to weigh, right? How do you represent all of your constituents on this and try to make this as equitable as possible for everybody involved?
And Navigator, correct me if I'm wrong, is in SFID 4, isn't
Correct. That is correct.
Not even in SFID 3.
So, when we do boundaries, one of the questions would be is does the board want those folks in that community to have access to Mangini and Alder Creek or not?
I think the biggest, I guess it's the elephant in the room, is the discussion about reorganization. Because the board has been told that if, for some reason, we do move forward with reorganization, it's about a 5-year process. Well, that 5-year process takes us up to the Measure M depletion, if it's successful. And if we follow the chart that we have before us on build-out timeline on slide 33, Rancho Cordova citizens will, and let's say it is successful, Rancho Cordova citizens will be paying for Folsom's school infrastructure for the next 30 years. And they won't have a single school that came from that Measure M. If the district does divide. That's a real problem. That's a problem that I think staff needs to seriously have some heart-to-heart conversations about. And maybe, again, similar to SFID 4, think big, reimagine, and see if there's a way we can get some infrastructure built in Rancho Cordova. So if the district, and that's an if, the district were to split, we would have facilities that came out of Measure M that existed in both Rancho Cordova and Folsom. I don't know how else you can be, fair about it if otherwise.
Yeah. And you know what? We thought a little big. So we brought you a slide or two.
All right, yeah.
To show you, so again, what we shared was the original design was actually to build Mather High and Morrison Creek Middle School. So this is a totally different model than what we have in the district, which is a shared central spine that has a shared administrative and support center down the middle, and you have middle school on one side and high school on another. And back when this design was developed in the early 2005-ish area, they went and looked at several schools that had this model. There are several schools that do. What this did was a combined campus on a very large piece of property. Originally, the plan was to duplicate this on both the Folsom and Rancho Cordova side, but when we were finalizing, maps, we weren't able to find a lot on the Folsom side that fit this structure. And so and originally, again, this was the first school that was going to be built, but once everything got scrapped, and then now we see development coming on the Folsom side, we shifted over to Folsom Ranch. But you can see here that the model here is a totally different model than what we have as a district, but would allow you to create economies of scale. There are some design components that are different, because you also have to remember this was done in 2005. So the educational specs that Matt was speaking to earlier have changed. Some of the things that happen with this design are different, but what I will share with you is that on a ability to complete this project, potentially this project would be something where it's relatively able to be completed similar in scope on a phasing, similar to Folsom Ranch. And so it's something that, we can talk further into in October, but you can see a picture of each. This is what a design of the Folsom Ranch looks like on top. This is Mather High, Morrison Creek down below. And so these were, both of these have been designed to, I don't know how close to DSA spec level, but pretty far along in both projects. But again, Mather High, Morrison Creek would require some upgrades to several areas. There was also an agreement for a public library with that. That front component, you see that triangle in the very front, was a very large library. It was supposed to be actually a public library. So we would have to relook at that and see, I don't know if that model would be there or not. But so there would definitely be some designs. We can talk through the designs. I don't think right at this, we can really dive into it more in the October meeting if you'd like. But here's Folsom Ranch. And you can see the big difference here is Folsom Ranch is a 2-story. Also, all of the walkways are internal, which adds a lot more to the cost because you're adding square footage, right? Because, whereas normally you have halls on the outer, right? But also has different collaboration spaces and different configuration based off of our ed specs, right? And obviously Terry, Matt, Jerry can speak to these things. And then here you have the model of Mather Morrison. And you see, if you kind of go from the bottom up, you see how there's a brown and then the blue, right? Blue is the high school side, brown is the middle school side. And then you do have duplication of some activities because you have a middle school field and a high school field, and you have some of those pieces. And then that location, that particular property actually abuts to a park where there would be additional play fields. But conceptually, also, there's other things there. There's a central kitchen there. And so some of those pieces we would need to look at. So there is quite a bit of design that would need to happen. Not quite a bit. There is some design there. There is some second story on that facility, right, Terry? You want to speak to that?
Yeah, there are some second story components on the high school side already, just again, scale tends to make you go multi-story. But there is a lot that is single story as well.
Yeah. And so there are some ed spec standards that are different than what were generated for when Folsom Ranch was designed. And so that does do some pieces when it comes to cost and some of the other things. So there are pieces that we would need to discuss if that was something the board wanted to look at. So really what we're presenting here is the capacity at elementary really does require us to build all those elementaries on the Folsom side. The high school, middle school campus, potentially we could look at a think big option or outside the box option of shifting. However, that would require additional transportation, potentially for those on the Folsom side to get over to the Rancho side. However, we think there will be access from 2 different avenues through the White Rock side and then down Douglas and around as well. Depending on how the build out is in time for this development, right? There's a lot of questions associated with that. But that would allow us potentially to get 2 schools in, relatively close in price for 1 school, potentially.
What are those 2 intersecting streets? I know they're probably not built yet, but.
Matt?
One is Rancho Cordova Parkway and...
Is Rancho Cordova Parkway the street that's going to have an interchange on Highway 50?
So Rancho Cordova Parkway is coming. The one to the bottom actually will connect up to White Rock. That's going to be in not too long. The other one, I think it does connect up. I think it is an interchange.
That future interchange.
Yeah, to the left of the campus.
Yeah.
The idea of the ed spec of this was easing of grade transition. It was approved back in 2005, the ed spec, and it was to have kids as they age from 6th through 8th, 9th, 10th to be on the same campus and to be able to, easier for them to progress as they went into high school. So the further away you are from the admin, that you go to 12th grade and then you're closer to 9th grade and then 6th grade is closer. So that was the concept of this campus.
I am a little bit of a fan of switching in the fact that we are building elementary schools very rapidly in Folsom, and we have the high school on deck, but we have the middle school for Folsom quite a bit farther down the line, and we already have, I think we were at Folsom Middle School, and they were already saying that 8th grade was going to be pretty full. So where are we putting these elementary school students if we don't have that middle school on deck kind of right away?
Yeah. Do you want to
So I think that maybe doing a combined site might be a benefit, because for those students, then they would be also access to that middle school a lot sooner than later, with a relatively, you know, I mean, it's still gonna be a little distance to drive, but we're not talking extreme distances. So, I mean, I do kind of like the thought that we would get a middle school and a high school sooner for those kids, because I'm a little bit concerned about what's gonna happen at Sutter and at Folsom if we don't have that middle school kind of up on deck soon.
One reason why the middle school is planned out further in Folsom Ranch is because we do have 2 middle schools in Folsom, 2 larger schools, and as I was talking a little bit earlier, some of the birth rates are down, so we're seeing some lower grade levels coming through, and we anticipate that, you know, with the growth coming from south of 50 into that, with the lower growth, it'll be able to maintain that for a longer period of time, having 2 schools. That's kind of where we're looking at right now. We'll obviously continue to monitor that, but we have a little more flexibility, we think, at the middle school for a longer period.
And do you want to also talk about Cordova High? I think we have capacity. That's actually an area more of a concern for capacity. So.
Yeah, actually, you know, Cordova High is at capacity. That's an issue, especially, you know, being an IB school. At issue, there's almost 2,000 kids there. The ability to take additional students from this Rio Del Oro growth area or other areas will be challenging as well there. We would have to look at facility impacts of Cordova High School as the growth continues.
So we were just bringing this as thinking big, something outside the box, and with also the voice of the board in the fact that there was concerns about equity of the distribution of Measure M funds. And so I think where we are on this is, creating high schools, building high schools is a half a decade project, right? If not longer. And so, if this is something that the board is interested in really deep diving in and looking at it, really we need to start having discussions now about that, because obviously it impacts our design, but also it impacts the community, right? And so we would need to make sure we can share the direction of the board and what the next steps would be that you would want to do. So what we're thinking on this is, if you're interested in looking at this, doing some comparisons, maybe looking at some cost pieces, diving into Measure M a little more, we can do that at the next board meeting as well. So we would, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, but I think where we're at is, it sounds like board has given us directive on SFID 4 and 5, so we would continue that. We can bring back an update on that in October, and then start working with the RFPs, start working on the surveys, start all those pieces. We also, just as we have a RFP right now already out for architect services, we're also going to be doing it for financial advisor, all these other pieces. So we're going to put all those things out here probably in this month of September. So we'll get all those things going. So it's really going to be ramping up for us. We also are working with we just signed our contract with our demographics folks to do an analysis, because we have to do boundaries, which everybody loves, with regards to Alder Creek coming online. So that'll be a big conversation here in the next couple of months that you guys will get to jump in on. And then I think in October we can do a deeper dive on Measure M and specifically start talking about comparison of some options with regards to the high school, potential high school, middle school option, and get some direction from you. I know Terry's chomping at the bit. She'd love to get going one way or the other. She's got plans going in multiple directions, and so we can talk about that as well. And we can talk about it in relation to the master plan in general. We can try to look at maybe some demographic information. By October, month sounds like a long way away, but the truth is we'll get at least preliminary information that will allow you to at least give you a focus towards kind of what options would be available. So
I have a really quick question for Matt. How feasible would it be to flip the 2 high schools as far as infrastructure goes? Like, are we talking that roads are going to be available into that site soon, or how far off are we on that?
We think that the roads will be available to get to this school. Some of the infrastructure is in place. They're developing now.
Okay.
That would be one of the.
We'd reach out to the developers as well and find out. I mean, obviously, this is just very preliminary conversation with you guys at this point, but
yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks.
So, just coming back, any questions, thoughts, or are we?
Let me first see if there's any public comment for SFID 3. Doesn't appear to be. Yeah, I mean, is this something that we could, that you could bring back the various options at our next meeting for final decision? Because I certainly, obviously, we're not scheduled here to give you any final decision. This is just a study session. But, obviously, one of our board members isn't here, and, we do need the full board here for such a decision like this.
Oh, for sure.
So, at least my thinking is, come back with various options, similar to our direction on SFID 4. Come give us the various options. I think it's the same thing goes here. Give us the various options on SFID 3.
For October, we can work on both those.
Does that work? Yeah. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. All right. I guess, any final remarks from the board? No? Staff, any final remarks?
No, just I want to thank our team. There's a lot of work that went into tonight's presentation, but as you can see, there's a lot to think about and consider. It's an exciting time in Folsom, Cordova, as we think about planning for the future and, being on the decision side of that. So we look forward to bringing back the information on October 9th with many options and thinking outside the box, especially for SFID 4 and SFID 3.
Yeah, and I echo, thank you, staff. This was quite the presentation. I'm sure it did not, I'm sure it took a very long time. Perhaps a little bit longer in the summertime than you had perhaps planned, but thank you. The board definitely appreciates it. All right, with that, we're at adjournment. So unless there's an objection, we will adjourn by unanimous consent. Hearing, did you have? No, okay. Hearing no objection, we're adjourned.